Tonight we begin with a simple question that's going to haunt you for the next hour. What if I told you that the Bermuda Triangle isn't just some mysterious patch of ocean where planes vanish and compasses spin wildly, but actually a perfectly explainable death trap that would kill you in about a dozen different ways before you even realized you were in danger? Forget every documentary you've ever watched with ominous music and dramatic recreations of ships disappearing into fog. Forget the theories about alien abductions and portals to other dimensions and magnetic anomalies that defy physics. Tonight we're stripping away decades of sensationalized mythology to show you the actual, scientific, brutally efficient ways this region of the Atlantic Ocean between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico would end your life. Because here's what nobody tells you when they're breathlessly recounting tales of Flight 19 or the USS Cyclops. The Bermuda Triangle kills people the same way every other part of the ocean kills people, except it does it more frequently, more violently, and with absolutely zero regard for your YouTube-educated confidence that you could survive where others failed. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a 40-foot yacht, sun beating down on crystal blue water that stretches endlessly in every direction, and you're thinking this looks exactly like every Caribbean vacation commercial you've ever seen. The water is that impossible shade of turquoise that doesn't look real in photographs. The sky is cloudless. Your GPS is working perfectly. Your radio is crackling with weather reports that promise smooth sailing for the next 72 hours. You've got provisions, experience, and that distinctly modern arrogance that comes from having Google Maps in your pocket and assuming that technology has somehow made the ocean less capable of killing you. And that's your first mistake. Because while you're admiring the view and thinking about which social media platform gets the sunset photo, the ocean beneath you is actively preparing approximately 15 different ways to ensure you never post anything ever again. See, the Bermuda Triangle isn't mysterious because of supernatural forces or government conspiracies or anything else that makes for good late-night cable television. It's mysterious because it's one of the most heavily traveled shipping lanes in the world, meaning more vessels pass through it than almost anywhere else on Earth, which means statistically more vessels are going to sink there than in some random patch of the Pacific nobody ever visits. It's mysterious because it sits at the intersection of multiple weather systems that can spawn storms with virtually no warning, turning that picture-perfect Caribbean day into a maritime nightmare in less time than it takes you to finish reading this sentence. It's mysterious because the ocean floor beneath you drops off into trenches so deep that anything that sinks there will never be recovered, creating the illusion that ships and planes simply vanished into thin air when really they're just resting in pieces 4 miles below the surface where no submarine can reach them. It's mysterious because human beings are absolutely terrible at understanding statistics and probability, and we prefer exciting explanations involving UFOs over boring explanations involving human error and mechanical failure, and the simple fact that the ocean has been efficiently killing sailors since the first person decided it would be fun to tie some logs together and venture away from shore. But you don't know any of this yet. You're still standing on that deck, enjoying the breeze, completely unaware that you've just entered one of the most unforgiving environments on the planet. You don't know that the calm water beneath you is currently being influenced by the Gulf Stream, a river within the ocean that moves at speeds up to 5 miles per hour and can push your vessel dozens of miles off course without you even realizing it. You don't know that magnetic variations in this region can make your compass readings off by as much as 20 degrees, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that being off by 20 degrees over 100 miles means you're now 40 miles away from where you think you are. You don't know that the shallow waters and coral reefs that make this area so beautiful also make it incredibly dangerous for navigation, with hundreds of documented wrecks littering the seafloor like a maritime graveyard. You don't know that methane hydrates trapped in the continental shelf can occasionally release massive bubbles of gas that reduce the water's density so dramatically that ships lose buoyancy and sink in seconds. You don't know any of this because you've been educated by entertainment rather than reality, and entertainment has convinced you that the Bermuda Triangle is spooky rather than simply deadly. Let's talk about what's happening right now beneath that deceptively calm surface while you're still congratulating yourself on choosing such a beautiful day for your voyage. The Gulf Stream, that massive ocean conveyor belt we mentioned, isn't just some gentle current that helps sea turtles migrate or makes European winters slightly less miserable. It's a river of water moving through the ocean at speeds that would impress most joggers, carrying roughly 30 million cubic meters of water per second through this exact region where you're currently floating and feeling clever about your navigation skills. Think about that number for a moment. 30 million cubic meters per second. That's more water than flows over Niagara Falls by a factor of about 600, except it's invisible, and instead of falling dramatically over rocks while tourists take photos, it's quietly and efficiently pushing your vessel in directions you haven't accounted for because your GPS is telling you you're exactly where you think you are, except you're not, because GPS tells you where you are right now but doesn't account for where the ocean is taking you between position updates. So while you're checking your instruments and seeing everything nominal, the Gulf Stream is engaged in a slow-motion kidnapping, dragging you northeast at speeds that compound every hour you're out here. Plot a course for Bermuda from Miami, and if you don't account for this current, you'll miss the island entirely and find yourself heading toward the open Atlantic with fuel running low and confusion mounting about how your careful calculations could have failed so spectacularly. But the Gulf Stream isn't even the most interesting thing about the water beneath you right now. Let's talk about those methane hydrates we mentioned, because they sound made up, but they're absolutely real and they're absolutely terrifying in their implications. Deep beneath the ocean floor in this region, trapped in sediment and kept solid by the intense pressure and cold temperatures of the deep ocean, there are deposits of methane ice. Yes, ice made of methane, which exists in a strange frozen state that seems to defy what you think you know about both ice and gas. Under normal circumstances, this methane stays right where it is, locked in place by physics and the weight of all that water above it. But circumstances aren't always normal. Underwater landslides, earthquakes, changes in ocean temperature, or just the random chaos of geological processes can cause these deposits to suddenly release, sending massive plumes of methane gas rocketing toward the surface. And here's where it gets interesting in the worst possible way. When that gas reaches the surface, it creates a zone of water that's no longer dense enough to support the weight of your vessel. Imagine you're floating on water that suddenly becomes more air than liquid. Your boat, which was happily obeying the laws of buoyancy, suddenly finds those laws have been suspended, and it sinks. Not slowly, not with time for dramatic radio calls or launching lifeboats, just straight down, often with barely enough time for the crew to realize something is catastrophically wrong. Ships have been found on the ocean floor in this region, sitting perfectly upright, as if they were gently placed there rather than sunk in some violent storm. And methane release is one of the more plausible explanations for how that happens. The ship doesn't capsize or break apart. It just loses buoyancy and descends, sometimes so quickly that the crew doesn't even have time to send a distress signal. One moment you're sailing along, admiring the view. The next moment the ocean is swallowing you whole. No warning, no chance to prepare. Just physics betraying you in a way you never knew was possible. And before you start thinking that sounds rare enough to not worry about, remember that you're sailing through one of the most geologically active underwater zones in the Western Hemisphere, with fault lines and trenches and unstable sediment deposits that make methane releases statistically more likely here than in most other parts of the ocean. You're not just sailing through water. You're sailing through a minefield where the mines are invisible, unpredictable, and composed of physics-defying geology. But let's say you get lucky and avoid the methane. Let's say the Gulf Stream's influence on your navigation is minimal because you're only doing a short hop between islands. There's still the small matter of the weather, which in this region can transform from postcard perfect to actively homicidal faster than you can tie a proper bowline knot. The Bermuda Triangle sits right in the path of hurricanes spinning up from the Atlantic, tropical storms forming in the Caribbean, and weather fronts colliding from multiple directions, because this region is basically Grand Central Station for meteorological violence. We need to talk about something that's going to challenge every weather forecast you've ever trusted, every meteorological prediction you've ever based a decision on, and every assumption you have about your ability to see a storm coming before it arrives. In most parts of the world, storms build gradually enough that you get warning. Clouds darken over the course of hours. Barometric pressure drops steadily. Wind picks up in measurable stages. You watch the horizon and see the storm front approaching like an army on the march, giving you time to secure hatches, check your anchor, maybe even make a run for harbor if you're close enough to shore. Not here. In the Bermuda Triangle, storms can materialize with the subtlety of a car crash, going from clear skies to life-threatening conditions in literally minutes, because the convergence of warm Caribbean water, cold Atlantic currents, and the jet stream creates a meteorological petri dish for rapid storm development. You're not dealing with normal weather patterns that follow predictable rules. You're dealing with atmospheric chaos where thunderstorms can explode vertically to heights of 50,000 feet in less than an hour, generating winds that would strip paint off steel and waves that can flip vessels twice the size of yours. And here's the thing about these sudden storms that weather forecasters often can't predict with any accuracy. They're not just violent, they're bizarrely localized. You can have perfectly calm conditions 5 miles to your north while you're getting pummeled by 70-knot winds and 20-foot seas because the storm cell is compact and moving fast, and your weather radar, if you even have sophisticated enough equipment to see it coming, might only give you 10 or 15 minutes of warning before you're fighting for your life. The ocean doesn't care about your forecast. It doesn't care that 3 different weather services promised you smooth sailing. It especially doesn't care about your expensive marine electronics and your subscription to premium weather routing services, because all of that technology is trying to predict a chaotic system that sometimes refuses to be predicted. Meteorologists will tell you honestly that small-scale convective events, the kind that can kill you just as dead as a hurricane, are nearly impossible to forecast with precision because they depend on micro-scale atmospheric conditions that can't be measured in real time with current technology. So you're sailing along in sunshine. Maybe you notice the barometer dropping slightly. Maybe you see some clouds building on the horizon, but nothing that looks immediately threatening. And then suddenly the wind shifts violently, the temperature drops 10 degrees in as many seconds, and the sky turns that peculiar shade of greenish black that anyone who's survived a serious storm learns to fear instinctively. You've got maybe 5 minutes to get everything secured, to put on your safety harness, to make sure your emergency beacon is accessible and your life raft is ready to deploy. Assuming you even have that much time, and assuming you react perfectly to every warning sign without panicking or making the kind of mistakes that people make when they suddenly realize they're in mortal danger, most people don't react perfectly. Most people hesitate or convince themselves it's not that bad, or waste precious seconds doing things that don't matter while neglecting things that do. And then the storm hits and it's too late for preparation because now you're just trying to survive the next wave and the next one after that, and hoping your boat holds together long enough for the storm to pass. But let's say you're lucky again. Let's say you somehow avoided the methane, navigated perfectly despite the Gulf Stream, and didn't encounter any freak storms. You're still not safe, because now we need to discuss the magnetic anomalies that give this region part of its mysterious reputation, except they're not actually mysterious at all if you understand basic geology and planetary magnetism. The Earth's magnetic field isn't uniform. It varies based on the composition of the crust beneath you, the presence of iron deposits, the angle of the magnetic poles relative to your position, and about a dozen other factors that geology students study and sailors mostly ignore until those variations cause their compass to lie to them. In the Bermuda Triangle, the declination between true north and magnetic north can vary significantly depending on exactly where you are. And if you don't account for this correctly in your navigation, you can end up miles off course without realizing it. Your compass isn't broken. It's just pointing at magnetic north, which isn't the same as true north. And the difference between those two things changes depending on where you are on the planet. In some parts of the world, the variation is minimal and you can basically ignore it. In the Bermuda Triangle, ignoring it means you're navigating with an instrument that's consistently giving you wrong information, and you're doing it in a region where being off by even a few degrees can mean the difference between reaching your destination and sailing past it into the open ocean, where rescue becomes exponentially less likely with every mile you travel in the wrong direction. Now let's talk about what happens when you combine navigational errors with the Gulf Stream's relentless push and the ocean's complete indifference to your survival, because this is where things get properly terrifying from a search and rescue perspective. When someone goes missing in the Bermuda Triangle, rescue teams face a challenge that doesn't exist in most other maritime regions. They have no idea where to actually look. Normally, when a vessel sends a distress call or fails to arrive at its destination, searchers can make reasonable assumptions about where it might be based on its last known position and intended route. But in the Bermuda Triangle, that last known position might be wrong due to compass errors, and the vessel might have been pushed miles off its intended route by currents the crew didn't properly account for. And even if the crew knew exactly where they were when something went wrong, the search area expands exponentially with every hour that passes because the ocean is moving, taking any survivors or debris with it in directions that require complex mathematical models to predict. This is why aircraft disappearances in this region are particularly baffling. A plane crashes into the ocean, and within minutes it's sinking to depths that make recovery impossible. The debris field, if there is one, immediately starts drifting with currents that can move it dozens of miles in a single day. By the time search planes arrive on scene, they're looking for tiny pieces of wreckage scattered across hundreds or thousands of square miles of ocean that all looks identical from the air. Blue water stretching to every horizon, no landmarks, no reference points, just endless waves that could be hiding evidence of a tragedy or could just be empty ocean, and there's no way to tell the difference from 1,500 feet up. Add in the depth of the water in most of this region, where the ocean floor is 3 or 4 miles down, and you have a situation where even finding wreckage is nearly impossible, let alone recovering it. The deepest diving submarines can only reach about 2 miles down, and those are rare, expensive pieces of equipment that aren't just sitting around waiting to search for lost aircraft. So planes vanish, not because of mysterious forces, but because the ocean is very good at swallowing things and very bad at giving them back. Ships face similar challenges, but with the added complication that they can stay afloat longer while drifting further off course, meaning survivors could potentially be anywhere within a massive search radius that grows larger every hour. And if the ship sinks, you're right back to the airplane problem, wreckage on an ocean floor that might as well be on another planet for how accessible it is to search teams. This is what created the mythology of the Bermuda Triangle. Not supernatural disappearances, but the very practical problem of things sinking in deep water and drifting in strong currents, making them nearly impossible to find even when you know roughly where to look. It's not mystery, it's just math, oceanography, and the uncomfortable truth that the ocean is still much better at hiding things than humans are at finding them. Consider the most famous cases that built the Bermuda Triangle's reputation. Flight 19, the group of 5 Navy torpedo bombers that vanished in 1945, is often cited as proof of the triangle's mysterious nature. But read the actual radio transcripts from that flight, the ones that aren't edited for dramatic effect, and you'll see exactly what happened. The flight leader got disoriented, possibly due to compass malfunction or simply misreading his instruments, led the formation in the wrong direction, and they ran out of fuel over the ocean at night. No mystery. Just a navigation error that ended with 5 aircraft hitting the water in darkness, sinking rapidly, and leaving no survivors and minimal debris in an area of ocean that's thousands of feet deep. The search plane that vanished while looking for them, that was a Mariner seaplane, a type known for fuel leaks and in-flight fires. One was seen exploding in the air that night. Again, no mystery. Just a tragic accident involving an aircraft that had known design flaws. But the mythology persists because humans are wired to find patterns even where none exist, to prefer exciting supernatural explanations over boring technical ones, and to remember the dramatic stories while forgetting the thousands of ships and planes that transit the Bermuda Triangle every year without incident. You're statistically more likely to die in a car accident driving to the marina than you are to vanish mysteriously in the Bermuda Triangle. But car accidents don't generate late-night documentaries with ominous narration and dramatic recreations. Maritime disasters in a region famous for maritime disasters, that's just good television. So the myth perpetuates itself. New generations hear the stories, and people keep attributing mundane accidents to supernatural causes because the truth that the ocean is dangerous and navigation is hard and sometimes people make mistakes with fatal consequences is somehow less satisfying than believing in cursed waters or alien abductions or whatever explanation preserves the sense that there's something special and mysterious about this particular patch of ocean, rather than just acknowledging it's a heavily trafficked area where accidents happen with slightly higher frequency than average due to a combination of geography, weather patterns, and the statistical reality of high traffic volume. But let's get back to you, floating on your yacht, still convinced you're going to be fine because you've read all the debunking articles and you know the Bermuda Triangle isn't actually supernatural. You understand the science, you're prepared, you've got modern equipment. What you don't have is experience with how quickly everything can go wrong simultaneously, because that's the real danger here. Not any single factor, but the convergence of multiple problems at the same time, each one compounding the others until you're facing a cascade failure that your preparation and knowledge can't prevent. Let's walk through a scenario that's happened dozens of times to vessels in this region, with minor variations but always the same basic progression from confidence to catastrophe. You're cruising along in good weather, making steady progress toward your destination. Your GPS shows you exactly where you are. Your fuel reserves are adequate. Your engine is running smoothly. Everything is nominal. Then you notice the barometer starting to drop. Not dramatically at first, just a gradual decline that gets your attention but doesn't trigger any immediate alarm. You check the weather forecast on your satellite phone and it still shows clear conditions for the next 24 hours. So you continue on, making a mental note to keep an eye on the pressure but not changing course or seeking shelter. This is mistake number one, trusting the forecast more than your instruments, because that dropping barometer is telling you something the meteorologists missed or couldn't predict. There's a storm developing nearby, one of those compact, violent cells we discussed earlier. While you're sailing along, reassuring yourself that the forecast says everything is fine, the storm is organizing itself 15 miles to your south, building strength and rotating in a way that's going to bring it directly across your path. By the time you see the first visual signs of the approaching storm, dark clouds on the horizon moving faster than they should, you've got maybe 20 minutes before conditions deteriorate seriously. You start securing loose items on deck, closing hatches, preparing for rough weather. Textbook response, exactly what you're supposed to do. But while you're doing all that, focused on immediate storm preparation, you're not paying attention to your navigation, and the Gulf Stream has been pushing you northeast for the past several hours at a rate slightly higher than you calculated, meaning you're now 5 miles further from your intended course than your last position check suggested. You don't know this yet. You're about to find out in the worst possible way. The storm hits with that sudden violence we described, going from manageable to severe in what feels like seconds. Wind jumps from 15 knots to 50. Seas build from 3-foot rollers to 12-foot mountains. Rain comes down so hard you can't see the bow of your own boat. Your yacht, which felt substantial and seaworthy an hour ago, is suddenly being tossed like a toy in a bathtub. Your hand steering now because the autopilot can't handle these conditions, fighting the wheel to keep the bow pointed into the waves, trying to maintain enough speed to keep steerage without going so fast you bury the bow in a wave and flood the deck. This is when you discover that all your careful preparation didn't include practicing this exact scenario in these exact conditions, and there's a significant difference between knowing theoretically what to do in a storm and actually doing it when every wave threatens to roll your vessel and the noise is so loud you can't think clearly and your body is being thrown around the cockpit hard enough to leave bruises. You're operating on adrenaline and instinct now, And some of your instincts are wrong because they're based on assumptions about how boats behave that don't apply in these conditions. You're also starting to feel seasick, which you didn't expect because you've been on boats before and never had a problem. But you've never been on a boat in seas this violent for this long, and your body is discovering that it has limits you weren't aware of. The nausea is distracting, making it harder to focus on the critical tasks of keeping the boat under control. And you're trying to ignore it, trying to push through, but it's affecting your decision-making in ways you don't recognize yet. You consider turning on your emergency beacon, but decide against it because you're not actually sinking, just uncomfortable, and you don't want to trigger a rescue operation unnecessarily. This is mistake number 2. Waiting too long to call for help, because the time to activate your beacon is when you first think you might need rescue, not when you're certain you need rescue, because by the time you're certain conditions might have deteriorated to the point where rescue is no longer possible or where you're physically unable to trigger the beacon. But you don't know this. You're thinking about the embarrassment of calling for help and then not needing it, about the cost of a rescue operation, about maintaining your pride and your reputation as a competent sailor. All very human concerns that have killed more sailors than any supernatural force ever could. The storm continues for 3 hours, which doesn't sound like a long time until you've lived through every minute of it, every wave threatening to be the one that finally overwhelms your vessel, every gust of wind making you wonder if the rigging will hold, every sound of stressed metal and creaking fiberglass making you question whether the boat's structural integrity is about to fail catastrophically. Your arms ache from fighting the wheel. Your legs are cramping from bracing yourself against the violent motion. You're soaked, despite your foul weather gear, because water finds a way in no matter how well sealed you think your clothing is. And now you're dealing with the early stages of hypothermia on top of everything else, your body temperature dropping degree by degree as wet clothing conducts heat away from your core faster than you can generate it. You're shivering uncontrollably, which makes fine motor control difficult, which means working the instruments and controls is becoming progressively harder. Your fingers are numb, your thinking is getting fuzzy around the edges, that particular fog that comes with cold and exhaustion, making it hard to remember what you were supposed to do next, why you made certain decisions, whether you already checked that particular gauge or just thought about checking it. This is when mistakes multiply, when you start making errors in judgment that you'd never make under normal circumstances, when you might shut off a critical system because you forgot why it was running in the first place, or failed to notice warning signs that would be obvious if you were warm and rested and thinking clearly. And then finally the storm passes, the wind drops, the seas begin to moderate, rain eases to a drizzle and then stops entirely. Weak sunlight breaks through the clouds. You've survived. You allow yourself a moment of relief, of pride even, thinking about the story you'll tell back at the marina about weathering a serious blow in the Bermuda Triangle. You're exhausted but triumphant, ready to assess any damage and continue on your way. This is the moment when you discover just how lost you actually are. Because while you were fighting the storm, the combination of wind, waves, and current pushed you approximately 20 miles from where your last accurate position fix placed you, and you were pushed in a direction that your storm tactics and survival instincts suggested, but that doesn't match your intended course at all. You check your GPS and see coordinates that look wrong, that can't possibly be right. So you check again, and the numbers are the same, and slowly You realize that you're not where you thought you were going to be after the storm. You're nowhere close. And your fuel reserves that seemed adequate when you started are now marginal at best for reaching the nearest safe harbor, assuming you can even figure out which harbor is actually nearest given your current position. Your compass, which you haven't really needed to rely on because GPS is so much more accurate and convenient, is still showing that magnetic variation we discussed. And in your exhausted, cold-addled state, you make mistake number 3. You misapply the correction factor. Instead of adding degrees to account for the variation, you subtract them, or vice versa. And now you're not just lost, you're heading in a direction that's taking you further from safety with every mile you travel. You don't realize this yet because your GPS is still working, still showing your position updating as you move, and you're following a course that looks correct on your chart plotter. But that chart plotter is pointing you toward what you think is the nearest harbor when it's actually taking you further into the open Atlantic. And by the time you realize the error, you've burned through another 2 hours of fuel and daylight, and now your situation has gone from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. The sun is getting low. You're cold, wet, exhausted, mildly hypothermic, and running low on fuel in the middle of the ocean with night approaching. This would be an excellent time to activate that emergency beacon we talked about earlier, but your pride is still operational even if your judgment isn't, and you convince yourself you can fix this. You can navigate back to safety. You just need to focus and figure out where you went wrong with your calculations. So you spend another hour poring over charts, checking and rechecking your position, trying to work out a course that will get you to land before you run out of fuel. And it's during this hour of focused navigation work that you fail to notice the hull damage the storm caused. The small crack in the fiberglass that's now leaking seawater into your bilge at a rate of about a gallon every 10 minutes, which doesn't sound like much until you do the math and realize that's 6 gallons an hour. And your bilge pump, which should automatically activate when water reaches a certain level, has failed for reasons you haven't had time to diagnose and won't discover until water is sloshing around your feet and you finally think to check why you're hearing that sloshing sound. Now you're bailing, not with a sophisticated bilge pump system, because that failed, but with a bucket, manually scooping water from your bilge and dumping it overboard, which is exhausting work even when you're well rested and warm, and you're neither of those things. You're running on fumes, both literally in terms of your fuel tank and figuratively in terms of your body's remaining energy reserves. Each bucket of water you bail requires bending down, scooping, lifting, turning, and dumping, probably 30 pounds of effort per repetition, and you need to do this continuously just to keep up with the leak, not even reducing the water level, just maintaining a precarious equilibrium where you're removing water at roughly the same rate it's coming in. You do this for 15 minutes and realize you can't sustain this pace. Your back is screaming, your shoulders are burning, your hands, already cold and numb, are developing blisters from gripping the bucket handle. You're breathing hard, heart pounding, and you're starting to understand with crystalline clarity that you're in serious trouble. The kind of trouble where all your previous decisions and mistakes have compounded into a situation where your survival is no longer guaranteed, where the ocean has you in a position where one more thing going wrong could be the thing that kills you. So finally, with darkness falling and water rising and fuel almost exhausted and your position uncertain and your body failing, you make the decision you should have made hours ago. You activate your emergency beacon, You pull the EPIRB from its bracket, extend the antenna, and press the activation button. A small LED begins blinking, indicating the beacon is transmitting your GPS coordinates to satellites overhead, which will relay that information to rescue coordination centers, which will dispatch whatever assets are available to attempt a rescue. This is the good news. The bad news is that you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean at night, probably 100 miles or more from the nearest Coast Guard station, in an area where multiple rescue operations are likely already in progress, because you're not the only person who underestimated the Bermuda Triangle today. And even under ideal conditions, rescue could take 6 to 12 hours to reach you. These are not ideal conditions. You're taking on water, you're almost out of fuel, night is falling, your body is hypothermic and exhausted. The seas, while calmer than during the storm, are still running 6 to 8 feet, which means any rescue operation involving helicopters or small boats is going to be challenging and potentially dangerous for the rescuers as well. You're now in a waiting game, and the question is whether help arrives before your boat sinks, or you become too hypothermic to function, or some new crisis emerges that you're too exhausted to handle effectively. Let's talk about what happens in the hours between activating that beacon and potential rescue, because this is where a lot of people's understanding of maritime emergencies diverges sharply from reality. You're not sitting comfortably waiting for the Coast Guard to show up like calling AAA for a tow truck. You're actively fighting to keep your vessel afloat while your body slowly shuts down from cold and exhaustion. You're bailing water in the dark because you need to conserve your batteries for essential systems, which means you're working by the dim light of a headlamp, bending and lifting and dumping in a rhythm that's become automatic but also increasingly difficult as your muscles fatigue and your coordination deteriorates. You're aware of every sound the boat makes, every creak and groan that might indicate structural failure, every wave that hits the hull with more force than the last one, every subtle change in the vessel's motion that might suggest it's becoming less stable as water accumulates in places you can't easily access. You're fighting a psychological battle against panic, against the very reasonable fear that the boat might sink before rescue arrives, against the temptation to just stop bailing and rest for a few minutes because you're so incredibly tired, except you know that if you stop, the water level will rise, and if it rises enough, the weight of the water will lower the boat in the water, which will make the leak worse because there's more water pressure against that crack in the hull, which will increase the leak rate, which means you'll need to bail even faster just to keep up. And you might already be past the point where one person can physically bail fast enough to keep ahead of the flooding. These are the thoughts going through your head in the dark while your hands mechanically scoop and dump, and you're trying to calculate how long you can maintain this pace. How long until the water wins? How long until someone arrives to pull you out of this mess you've created through a combination of bad luck, bad decisions, and underestimating an ocean that has been killing people since before recorded history and will continue killing people long after you're gone. 4 hours pass. 4 hours of continuous bailing with only brief breaks when your body absolutely demands rest, when your muscles seize up and refuse to respond to your commands till you give them a few minutes to recover. 4 hours of watching the horizon for any sign of approaching help. Aircraft lights, the searchlight of a Coast Guard cutter, anything that might indicate rescue is imminent. 4 hours of nothing but darkness and waves and the steady drip of water into your bilge. The leak hasn't gotten worse, which is the only good news, but it hasn't improved either. and you're reaching the point where you need to make some hard calculations about your odds of survival. Your boat, as best you can tell in the darkness, is still afloat and still reasonably stable, but you've got maybe another 6 hours of bailing energy left in your body before exhaustion forces you to stop. And if rescue doesn't arrive in that time frame, you're going to need to make a decision about the life raft. The life raft is your ultimate backup plan, the thing you deploy when the vessel is definitely sinking and staying aboard means going down with it. But here's the problem with life rafts that most people don't understand until they're facing the actual decision. A life raft is not a lifeboat. It's not a safe, comfortable alternative to your damaged vessel. It's a last resort, a desperate gamble that the incremental improvement in your immediate survival odds is worth the massive reduction in your long-term survival chances. Let me explain. Right now, despite the leak, you're on a 40-foot yacht with radar reflectors, a functioning radio, lights, an EPIRB that's transmitting your exact coordinates, and enough residual buoyancy that rescue aircraft or vessels will be able to see you from miles away. You're also relatively protected from the elements with a cabin that provides shelter from wind and spray, and you have access to food, water, and emergency supplies that you rationally packed before departure. If you abandon ship and climb into the life raft, you'll be trading all of that for a small inflatable raft with minimal visibility, no radio, no lights, except for a small battery-powered beacon that rescuers need to be much closer to see limited supplies, and absolutely zero protection from hypothermia except for whatever body heat you can generate and retain. The life raft is also going to be drifting with the current at a different rate than your yacht would drift, which means the position coordinates your EPIRB was transmitting are going to become progressively less accurate if rescue teams are actually looking for a yacht, but you're now in a raft miles away from where the yacht eventually sinks. So the calculation becomes, do you stay with the damaged vessel, keep bailing, and hope rescue arrives before the boat goes down? Or do you abandon to the life raft now while you still have the energy to make that transition safely, accepting all the downsides that come with that choice? There's no clear answer. Maritime survival experts argue about this constantly, and the correct choice depends on variables you can't accurately assess in the moment. How bad is the damage really? How much longer can you physically bail? How close is rescue? How will sea conditions change over the next few hours? What's your actual probability of capsizing versus sinking? And about a dozen other factors that require clear thinking and accurate information, neither of which you have right now. You're cold, exhausted, operating on adrenaline and fear, and trying to make a life or death decision with incomplete information and compromised judgment. This is the reality of survival situations that adventure stories and rescue documentaries gloss over. There often isn't a clear right answer, just a choice between bad options where you have to guess which one is slightly less likely to kill you. You decide to stay with the boat for now, to keep bailing, to give rescue more time to arrive while you still have a visible radio-equipped vessel for them to find. This might be the right choice. It might be the choice that kills you. You won't know until later, if there is a later. If you survive long enough to look back on this moment and evaluate whether your decision-making under stress was sound or whether you just got lucky. In the meantime, you bail. You watch the horizon. You fight against the hypothermia that's making your movements increasingly clumsy and your thinking increasingly fuzzy. You conserve your energy as much as possible while still working hard enough to keep the water level stable. You try not to think about the fact that you're probably going to be doing this all night, that dawn is still hours away, that even when the sun rises, there's no guarantee rescue will be visible on the horizon. You try not to think about the people who've been in similar situations in this exact region and didn't survive, whose last hours were spent bailing water in the dark, wondering if help would arrive in time, whose bodies were never recovered because they went down with vessels that sank in water too deep to ever search. You try not to think about any of that, but of course you do think about it because your mind won't stop processing all the what-ifs and worst-case scenarios, even while your body mechanically continues the exhausting work of trying to keep this boat afloat until someone comes to save you. Dawn finally comes, not with any dramatic sunrise that might lift your spirits, but with a gradual lightening of the sky from black to dark gray to that murky pre-dawn glow that makes everything look washed out and depressing. You're still bailing. You've been bailing for 8 hours now, and your body has moved past pain into that strange numb state where everything hurts so much that you've stopped really feeling individual aches and instead just exist in a general fog of discomfort and exhaustion. Your hands are destroyed, blisters on top of blisters, some burst, some still intact, all of them burning with that specific pain that comes from damaged skin repeatedly stressed. Your back has locked up in a position that's permanently hunched, and straightening up fully sends spasms of pain down your spine that make you gasp. Your legs are cramping randomly, muscles seizing up without warning, nearly dropping you a few times when you tried to stand. But you're alive, and your boat is still floating, and now that there's daylight, you can finally see the horizon clearly enough to spot any approaching rescue vessels. Except there aren't any. The ocean stretches empty in all directions, just like it did in darkness, except now you can see exactly how empty it is, how utterly alone you are out here, how there's nothing but water between you and the curve of the earth, no ships on the horizon, no aircraft overhead, no indication that anyone is coming or that anyone even received your distress signal. This is when the psychology of survival gets really interesting, when you start questioning whether the beacon is actually working, whether the satellites actually picked up your signal, whether rescue coordination centers are actually dispatching assets, or whether there's been some malfunction or miscommunication and nobody knows you're in trouble. You have no way to verify that your distress call was received. The EPIRB is blinking like it should, which suggests it's transmitting, but you've never actually tested whether it works because you're not supposed to activate these things unless it's a real emergency. And now that it is a real emergency, you have no confirmation that anyone heard you. This uncertainty is its own form of torture, worse in some ways than the physical exhaustion and pain, because at least with the physical suffering you know what you're dealing with. The uncertainty about whether rescue is coming makes it almost impossible to plan your next moves. Do you keep bailing, conserving the boat for a rescue that might never come? Do you prepare to abandon ship while you still have the strength? Do you ration your remaining food and water on the assumption that you might be out here for days? Or do you consume resources freely on the assumption that rescue is imminent? Every decision branches into multiple scenarios, and you don't have the mental energy or clarity to properly evaluate any of them. So you default to the simplest choice: keep doing what you're doing, keep bailing, keep the boat afloat, keep watching the horizon, keep hoping that the next time you look up, you'll see something that indicates help is on the way. This is how people die at sea, not from any single catastrophic event, but from grinding attrition, from exhaustion and exposure, and the slow erosion of hope from making slightly wrong decisions, compounded over hours until you're in a position where survival becomes improbable. You're not there yet, not quite, but you can feel yourself sliding toward that edge where your body and mind are so compromised that you're no longer capable of the complex problem solving and physical effort required to keep yourself alive. Another hour passes, 2 hours, 3. The sun is fully up now, beating down with that tropical intensity that should feel good after a night of hypothermic misery, but instead just adds heat exhaustion to your list of problems. You're dehydrated despite being surrounded by water because you've been sweating from the exertion of bailing and you didn't bring enough fresh water for an extended emergency. Having assumed you'd be making quick passages between islands with ample opportunities to resupply, dehydration is making the hypothermia worse, creating a vicious cycle where your body can't properly regulate temperature because it doesn't have enough fluids, which makes you more susceptible to cold, which makes you shiver more, which burns more calories and generates more metabolic waste that your kidneys can't properly filter because you're dehydrated. You're also starting to hallucinate little flickers at the edge of your vision that might be approaching rescue aircraft or might be your oxygen-deprived brain misfiring, and you're losing the ability to distinguish between what's real and what you're imagining. You see a helicopter on the horizon and your heart surges with hope and relief, but when you blink and focus, it's gone, just a cloud formation or a seabird or nothing at all. This happens multiple times, each false alarm draining a little more of your emotional resilience, each disappointment making it harder to maintain the hope that's been keeping you functional. You're approaching the point where people in survival situations start making catastrophically bad decisions, where exhaustion and despair override rational thinking, where you might do something like diving into the ocean to swim toward a rescue vessel that doesn't actually exist, or abandoning a relatively stable situation for some imagined better option that's really just your compromised brain telling you comforting lies about escape routes that don't exist. Let's pause your personal nightmare for a moment and talk about what's actually happening on the rescue coordination side of this equation, because understanding the challenges rescuers face in the Bermuda Triangle helps explain why help might not arrive as quickly as you desperately hope. When your EPIRB activated, it sent a signal to satellites that relayed your position to the Coast Guard's Rescue Coordination Center, probably the one in Miami given your location. That signal was received. There was no malfunction. Someone knows you're in trouble. But here's what you don't know while you're bailing water and hallucinating rescue helicopters. The Coast Guard received 17 other distress calls in the same general region within a 6-hour period around when you activated your beacon, because remember that storm system that nearly killed you also hit dozens of other vessels, and not all of them were as lucky or as prepared as you were. Some are sinking faster. Some have injured crew requiring immediate medical evacuation. Some have completely lost power and are drifting toward shipping lanes where collision with a cargo vessel is imminent. The rescue coordinators are performing a brutal triage, prioritizing responses based on severity of the emergency, number of people at risk, likelihood of survival, and available assets. Your situation, a solo sailor on a yacht that's taking on water but still afloat with an active beacon, is serious but not immediately life-threatening compared to a family of 4 on a capsized catamaran or a cargo ship with engine failure and 20 crew members. So you're on the list. Help is coming. but it's coming after several other rescues are completed, and each of those rescues takes time, and the helicopters and cutters have limited range and need to refuel, and the sea conditions that are making your life miserable are also making rescue operations significantly more dangerous and difficult. The Coast Guard is doing everything they can, but they're constrained by physics, logistics, and the simple fact that they can't be everywhere at once, even though they're going to try, because that's what they do. What they train for, what drives people to join an organization where you regularly risk your life trying to save strangers who made bad decisions in dangerous places. But from your perspective, sitting on that sinking yacht, you know none of this. All you know is that nobody has come, that you've been in distress for 12 hours now, that your body is failing, that your boat is slowly losing the battle with the ocean, and that every minute that passes makes survival less likely. So when you finally do see the helicopter, when you hear that distinctive beating sound of rotor blades cutting through air, and you look up and see an actual, real, not hallucinated Coast Guard helicopter approaching your position, the relief is so intense it's almost painful. A physical sensation of tension releasing that makes your knees buckle and brings tears to your eyes that you didn't think your dehydrated body could still produce. The helicopter circles your position, assessing the situation, and you can see the rescue swimmer in the door looking down at you with professional evaluation in their posture, determining the safest approach for extraction. Your boat is still afloat, but obviously in distress, listing slightly from the water in the bilge, and the seas, while calmer than last night, are still challenging enough that this rescue is going to require skill and precision. The helicopter hovers overhead, and you watch as the rescue swimmer prepares to deploy, going through pre-jump checks with practiced efficiency, and then suddenly they're descending on a cable, dropping toward the water with controlled speed, hitting the surface, and immediately disconnecting from the hoist, swimming toward your vessel with powerful strokes. This is the moment when your survival transitions from your responsibility to theirs, when trained professionals take over, and your only job is to follow instructions exactly as given, even if some of those instructions seem counterintuitive or dangerous, because these people have done this hundreds of times and they know what they're doing even when you don't. The swimmer reaches your boat and hauls themselves aboard with athletic efficiency, immediately assessing your condition with a quick visual evaluation that takes in your hypothermia, dehydration, exhaustion, and the state of your vessel. They're talking to you, asking questions about injuries, about how many people are on board, about whether you can stand and follow instructions, and you're trying to answer coherently, but your voice sounds strange even to yourself, slurred and slow like you're drunk, which is what severe exhaustion and hypothermia do to speech patterns. The swimmer is already wrapping a rescue harness around you, explaining what's about to happen. You're going to be hoisted up to the helicopter, and it's going to feel weird and scary being suspended beneath a helicopter on a thin cable, but you need to trust the equipment and the crew and keep your arms inside the harness and don't grab at the cable, and definitely don't look down if heights bother you. You nod understanding even though you're not sure you actually understood everything they said. And then the hoist hook is descending from the helicopter above, and the swimmer is attaching it to your harness with practiced motions, giving a thumbs up to the hoist operator, and suddenly you're lifting off the deck of your yacht, rising into the air on a swaying, spinning ascent that's exactly as disorienting and terrifying as promised. But you're also laughing or maybe crying because you're being rescued. You're going to live You survived the Bermuda Triangle not through any particular skill or preparation, but through a combination of good equipment, stubborn persistence, and the fact that trained professionals risked their lives to come pull you out of a situation you never should have gotten into in the first place. But hold on. Let's rewind this rescue scenario and talk about what happens when things don't go as smoothly as that idealized version suggests. Because not everyone who gets into trouble in the Bermuda Triangle gets pulled out by a Coast Guard helicopter in the nick of time. Let's explore an alternate timeline, one where the Rescue Coordination Center is even more overwhelmed than described, where your particular distress call gets delayed in the response queue, where the helicopter that was supposed to reach you develops a mechanical issue and has to return to base, where you're forced to make that decision about the life raft not as a theoretical exercise but as an immediate necessity when your yacht finally loses its battle with the ocean and begins to sink. You've been bailing for 14 hours when you feel the boat shift in a way that's fundamentally different from the motion you've grown accustomed to. It's subtle at first, a slight change in how the vessel responds to waves, a sluggishness that wasn't there before, and then you check the bilge and realize with cold horror that the water level has risen significantly despite your continuous bailing, which means the leak has gotten worse, which means the structural damage is progressing, which means you're out of time for hoping rescue arrives before you have to abandon ship. The decision is no longer theoretical. You need to get into that life raft now while you still have the physical capability to deploy it and while your yacht is still stable enough to launch from. You're operating on pure survival instinct now, moving through the deployment procedure with shaking hands, pulling the life raft canister from its bracket, reading the instructions that you should have memorized but didn't because you never really believed you'd need them, pull the activation cord, throw the canister overboard. The raft inflates automatically, a compressed CO2 cartridge filling the chambers with gas in a violent hiss of release that transforms a compact package into a bright orange inflatable structure in seconds. The raft is tethered to your sinking yacht by a painter line floating alongside in the moderate seas. And now comes the most dangerous part. Getting from the relative stability of your deck into that bouncing, unstable raft without falling into the water between them, because if you fall in with your level of exhaustion and hypothermia, you might not have the strength to pull yourself into the raft. And drowning while your survival equipment floats 3 feet away would be a particularly cruel way to die. You gather your emergency supplies, your EPIRB, which is still transmitting, your handheld VHF radio, whatever food and water you can quickly grab, and you stuff everything into a waterproof bag. You put on your life jacket, which you should have been wearing all along, but weren't because it was uncomfortable and you were already so tired and hot from bailing. You time the waves, waiting for a moment when both the yacht and the raft are relatively level with each other, and then you move, stepping from the deck to the raft's entry point in one committed motion that doesn't allow for hesitation or second guessing. You make it. You're in the raft. And immediately you understand just how much you've downgraded your survival situation, because everything about this is worse than being on the yacht. The raft is tiny, maybe 6 feet in diameter, with a fabric floor that flexes with every wave, creating a nauseating rolling motion that makes the yacht's motion seem gentle by comparison. There's a canopy to protect you from sun and spray, but it's low and claustrophobic, and the orange fabric fills everything with a weird filtered light that's somehow both too bright and too dim. You're wet, cold, exhausted, and now you're in an environment that offers zero comfort zero protection from the elements beyond what the thin fabric provides, and zero ability to actively work on your own rescue, you're completely passive now, drifting with the current, hoping your EPIRB is still transmitting, hoping rescue teams can find a 6-foot orange raft in an ocean that stretches thousands of miles in every direction. You watch your yacht sink. It doesn't go down dramatically like in movies, with the bow pointing skyward and a final plunge into the depths. It just settles lower and lower as water fills the hull, becoming more waterlogged, riding lower in the waves, until finally the ocean simply swallows it and it's gone, leaving nothing but some floating debris that quickly disperses in the current. You've just lost everything you owned that was aboard that vessel, all your carefully maintained equipment, all your supplies beyond what you managed to grab in those final frantic minutes, and most importantly, you've lost the large visible target that would have made you easy to spot from the air. Now you're trying to survive in a life raft, which means you're facing a completely different set of challenges that are going to test you in ways the sinking yacht never did, because at least on the yacht you could do something. You could bail and navigate and work on solutions. In the raft, you can only wait and hope and try not to think about how many people have died in life rafts, not from drowning or any dramatic cause, but from exposure, dehydration, and the slow psychological unraveling that comes from days or weeks of drifting with no control over your situation and no way to know if rescue is even looking for you anymore. The first 24 hours in the life raft are worse than anything you experienced on the yacht, and that's saying something considering what you went through bailing water for 14 hours straight. At least on the yacht you had tasks to perform, problems to solve, a sense that you were actively participating in your own survival. In the raft, there's nothing to do but endure. The motion is relentless and sickening, a combination of pitching, rolling, and random jerking as waves hit the raft from different angles. You're seasick within hours, vomiting over the side until there's nothing left in your stomach, and then dry heaving until your abdominal muscles are cramping and your throat is raw. The vomiting makes your dehydration worse, creating another vicious cycle where you need water to replace what you're losing, but you're too nauseous to keep water down, so you get more dehydrated, which makes you more susceptible to seasickness, which causes more vomiting. You try to sleep, but the motion makes it nearly impossible to get more than brief periods of unconsciousness that barely qualify as rest. You drift in and out of awareness, losing track of time, unsure whether minutes or hours have passed. The orange fabric of the canopy creates a weird temporal distortion where everything looks the same regardless of whether it's day or night, just varying degrees of orange filtered light. You check your EPIRB compulsively, making sure the LED is still blinking, that it's still transmitting, that someone somewhere knows you exist and needs help. But there's no way to know if the signal is actually reaching satellites, if rescue coordination centers are actually receiving your position, if anyone is actually coming. The EPIRB could be malfunctioning in ways that look normal to you but mean the signal isn't getting out. Or it could be working perfectly and rescue is simply too far away or too busy with other emergencies to reach you yet. You have no information, no feedback, no way to confirm that your distress call is doing anything productive. This uncertainty is psychologically devastating in ways that physical discomfort isn't, because at least with physical pain you know what you're dealing with. The not knowing creates a mental space where your imagination can conjure worst-case scenarios that your rational mind doesn't have enough information to dismiss, And so you spiral into anxiety spirals where you convince yourself that the EPIRB isn't working, that nobody is coming, that you're going to die in this raft from exposure or dehydration or simple exhaustion before anyone even knows to look for you. You try to ration your water supply, which consists of whatever you manage to grab in those frantic minutes before abandoning ship, plus the emergency water pouches stored in the life raft survival pack. You calculate and recalculate how long you can survive on what you have, trying to determine the optimal consumption rate that balances immediate hydration needs against the possibility of being stranded for days or weeks. The math is depressing no matter how you approach it. You've got maybe enough water for 3 or 4 days if you're extremely disciplined about rationing, less if the heat and sun cause more fluid loss through sweating than you're accounting for. After that, you're in serious trouble, because while humans can survive weeks without food, you can only go a few days without water before organ failure begins. And this is the Atlantic in the Caribbean region, where the sun is intense and the heat inside the raft's canopy can reach dangerous levels during the day, causing fluid loss that makes those water calculations even more pessimistic. You try to use the solar still that's included in the survival pack, a device that supposedly converts salt water into fresh water through evaporation and condensation. The theory is sound, but the practical reality is disappointing. The solar still produces barely a cup of water per day under optimal conditions, and these are not optimal conditions, and a cup of water per day is nowhere near enough to replace what you're losing through sweating, vomiting, and the simple metabolic requirements of keeping your body functioning. So the solar still is providing psychological comfort more than practical hydration, giving you something to do, some task that makes you feel like you're actively working on survival rather than just passively waiting to die. The psychological aspect of survival in a life raft is something that survival manuals mention but never really convey the full horror of, because it's one thing to read about the importance of maintaining hope and keeping busy and focusing on small tasks, and it's another thing entirely to actually do those things when you're cramped in a 6-foot raft, seasick, dehydrated, exhausted, sunburned, and acutely aware that every hour that passes without rescue makes survival less likely. Your mind starts playing tricks on you, not dramatic hallucinations like you experienced on the yacht, but subtle distortions of perception and memory where you're not sure if you just heard a helicopter or imagined it, where you can't remember if you already drank your ration of water for this time period or if you're just thinking about drinking it, where time becomes elastic and unreliable and you check your watch to discover that what felt like hours was actually 20 minutes, or what felt like 20 minutes was actually 4 hours. This temporal confusion is dangerous because it makes rationing supplies nearly impossible when you can't accurately track time. And it's also terrifying because it suggests your brain is not functioning normally, that the combination of dehydration, exhaustion, heat, and stress is causing cognitive impairment that's going to get worse before it gets better, assuming it gets better at all, assuming rescue arrives before your mind deteriorates to the point where you can't even remember why maintaining hope matters. Day 3 is when you start seriously contemplating whether dying might actually be preferable to continuing this existence. This isn't suicidal ideation in the clinical sense, more like a rational calculation about whether the slim possibility of rescue justifies the guaranteed agony of continuing to dehydrate and burn and suffer in this orange hell. Your water is gone, all of it. The emergency pouches, the bottles you grabbed, the pathetic output from the solar still. Everything is consumed, and now you're facing the reality that humans can only survive about 3 days without water, and you're right at that threshold, and every cell in your body is screaming for hydration that you cannot provide. You're tempted by the ocean, by the millions of gallons of water surrounding you that you cannot drink without accelerating your death. Seawater contains roughly 3.5% salt, which doesn't sound like much until you understand what that does to human physiology. Drinking seawater causes your kidneys to try to filter out the excess salt, but they can only produce urine at a maximum concentration of about 2% salt, which means that for every liter of seawater you drink, your kidneys need to use about 1.5 liters of water from your body to flush the salt out. You're not rehydrating, you're actually becoming more dehydrated by drinking seawater, plus you're forcing your already stressed kidneys to work harder on a task they can't actually accomplish, which leads to kidney failure, which leads to death. But your brain, starved of fluids and rational thought, keeps suggesting that maybe just a little seawater would help. Maybe the survival guides are too conservative. Maybe you're special and your body can handle what kills everyone else. This is how people die in life rafts when they have perfectly good emergency beacons and functioning rescue systems looking for them. They surrender to the temptation of the ocean and poison themselves with the very element that surrounds them. You haven't drunk seawater yet, but the temptation is growing stronger with every hour, and you're not sure how much longer you can resist when your mouth is so dry your tongue is sticking to the roof of your mouth and your throat is so parched that swallowing feels like rubbing sandpaper against raw tissue. You look at your arm, at the marker instructions you wrote yesterday, and you can barely remember writing them or why they seemed important, but you read them anyway. Do not drink seawater. You repeat this to yourself, a mantra against the impulse that's going to kill you if you let it, and you try to focus on something else, anything else, to distract yourself from the ocean that's both your prison and your temptation. The hallucinations are worse today. You're seeing things that aren't there with increasing frequency and conviction, ships on the horizon that vanish when you focus on them, aircraft overhead that turn out to be birds or clouds or nothing at all, rescue helicopters that you can hear clearly but never actually appear. You know, these are hallucinations, or at least part of you knows, but that knowledge doesn't make them less real in the moment, doesn't stop your heart from racing with hope every time you see something that might be rescue. Each false alarm is emotionally devastating, a roller coaster from desperate hope to crushing disappointment that takes a toll you can't afford, given how little psychological resilience you have remaining. You're also experiencing auditory hallucinations, hearing voices that definitely aren't there, hearing your name being called, hearing radio chatter and helicopter rotors and the sound of ships' engines, all of it convincing, all of it false. Your brain is so starved for stimulation and hope that it's manufacturing rescue scenarios, creating sensory experiences of salvation that don't exist except in your dying neurons. This is dangerous not just because it's psychologically exhausting, but because it might cause you to waste energy on response behaviors like attempting to signal rescue vessels that aren't actually there, or preparing to abandon the raft for a pickup that's not happening, or doing any number of things that burn calories and generate heat and worsen your condition in response to stimuli that only exist in your compromised mind. Let's talk about what the Coast Guard is actually doing while you're dying in this raft, because it's important to understand that the lack of rescue isn't necessarily due to incompetence or indifference, but to the brutal mathematics of search and rescue in the open ocean. When your EPIRB activated, it provided your initial position to rescue coordinators. That was 3 days ago. Since then, you've been drifting with the current, and not just any current, but the Gulf Stream, that massive ocean conveyor we discussed earlier that moves at speeds up to 5 miles per hour. In 3 days, you could have drifted anywhere from 200 to 300 miles from your initial position, and the search area grows exponentially with every hour because you're not drifting in a straight line. You're moving in a pattern that's influenced by wind, waves, and current variations that are difficult to predict with precision. The search teams are using sophisticated drift models that factor in all these variables, but those models have error margins measured in dozens of miles, which means the probable search area where you might be is enormous, probably thousands of square miles of open ocean that all looks identical from the air. They're flying search patterns, looking for a 6-foot orange raft in an ocean that extends to every horizon, which is like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach, except the beach is moving and the grain of sand is being blown around by wind you can't see. They're doing everything they can with the resources they have, but the ocean is vast and you are small, and the odds of visual acquisition are not in your favor, which is why so many EPIRB activations in the Bermuda Triangle result in delayed rescues or, in some cases, no rescue at all. Just a beacon that eventually stops transmitting, and a search that gets called off when the probability of finding survivors drops below the threshold that justifies continued operation. Day 2 in the life raft brings new horrors that yesterday's problems only hinted at. The sun is the enemy now, beating down on the orange canopy with relentless intensity, turning the interior of the raft into a sweltering greenhouse that would be unbearable even if you were healthy and well hydrated. But you're neither of those things. You're severely dehydrated, your lips are cracked and bleeding, your tongue feels swollen and wrong in your mouth, and every breath seems to pull moisture from your body that you can't afford to lose. You've rigged the canopy to provide maximum ventilation, creating openings that allow airflow while still protecting you from direct sun exposure, but it's not enough. The heat is cooking you from the inside out, raising your core temperature, forcing your body to sweat what little fluid it has left in a desperate attempt at thermoregulation that's actively making your dehydration worse. You're caught in another impossible biological trap. You need to stay cool to conserve water, but staying cool requires sweating, which depletes your water supply, which makes it harder to stay cool. Your body is trying to kill you to save you, and there's nothing you can do about it except endure and hope rescue arrives before the math of dehydration reaches its inevitable conclusion. The sunburn is spectacular. Despite your attempts to stay covered and protected, the sun reflecting off the water and bouncing off the orange fabric has burned exposed skin to a degree that would send most people to the emergency room under normal circumstances. Your face feels tight and swollen. Your arms are bright red with blisters forming, and any movement of your skin causes sharp pain that reminds you just how much surface area you have that's damaged and vulnerable. The sunburn is more than just painful, it's dangerous, because burned skin can't properly regulate temperature and it weeps fluid that you can't afford to lose, and it's vulnerable to infection. And out here in a life raft with no medical supplies beyond a basic first aid kit, infection is a death sentence delivered slowly. You try to protect yourself better on day 2, covering exposed skin with whatever fabric you can repurpose from your clothing, but the damage is done and continuing, and you're learning the hard way that the sun over the ocean is not like the sun anywhere else. because there's no shade, no escape, just endless reflected and direct radiation that finds every exposed inch of skin and punishes it. Let's talk about what's happening to your body on a physiological level, because understanding the mechanisms of your deterioration might help explain why survival in a life raft is so much harder than popular culture suggests. By day 2, you're experiencing moderate to severe dehydration, which means you've lost approximately 6 to 10% of your body weight in fluids. Your blood is literally thicker than it should be, more viscous, harder for your heart to pump through your circulatory system. This means your heart is working harder for every beat, which increases your metabolic rate, which generates more heat, which makes you sweat more, which accelerates the dehydration. Your kidneys are struggling, unable to effectively filter waste products from your blood because there's not enough fluid volume to work with. Waste products are accumulating in your bloodstream, effectively poisoning you from the inside with your own metabolic byproducts. Your blood pressure is dropping because there's not enough fluid volume to maintain proper pressure, which means your brain and vital organs aren't getting adequate blood flow, which causes confusion, dizziness, and cognitive impairment that makes rational decision-making increasingly difficult. Your electrolyte balance is completely disrupted. You've been losing sodium, potassium, and other essential minerals through sweat and vomit, and the water you are drinking can't replace those minerals, so you're developing imbalances that affect muscle function, nerve transmission, and cardiac rhythm. You might be experiencing muscle cramps, heart palpitations, and altered mental states that have nothing to do with psychology and everything to do with biochemistry. Your body is literally falling apart at the cellular level, and you can feel it happening, but you can't do anything about it, except hope that rescue arrives before the damage becomes irreversible. The mental degradation is worse than the physical suffering in some ways, because at least with physical pain you still feel like yourself, like the person you were before this nightmare started. But the cognitive impairment that comes with severe dehydration robs you of your identity, makes you question your own thoughts, makes you doubt your perceptions and memories and judgment. You find yourself making decisions that don't make sense, like seriously considering drinking seawater even though you know intellectually that will kill you faster, or contemplating abandoning the raft and swimming toward some imagined shore that you know doesn't exist. These aren't rational thoughts. They're the product of a brain that's been starved of proper hydration and is starting to misfire, creating impulses and ideas that your diminished rational capacity can barely recognize as dangerous, let alone resist. You're fighting a battle against your own failing mind, trying to maintain enough clarity to remember basic survival principles like don't drink seawater, stay with the raft, keep the EPIRB active, signal any aircraft you see, ration your water. These are simple rules that should be easy to follow, but when your brain is compromised by dehydration and heat and stress, even simple rules become complex challenges that require more cognitive capacity than you have available. You write reminders on your arm with a waterproof marker from the survival kit: do not drink seawater, stay in raft, conserve water. Simple imperative sentences that might keep you alive when your judgment fails completely. This is what survival in the Bermuda Triangle actually looks like. Not mysterious disappearances or supernatural phenomena, but simple biological deterioration happening on a timeline that rescue needs to beat if you're going to survive. Let's step back from your immediate suffering and talk about the other ways the Bermuda Triangle kills people, because your story of slow dehydration in a life raft is just one of many possible endings for those who venture into these waters unprepared or unlucky. Let's talk about the water spouts, those meteorological nightmares that are basically tornadoes over water and occur with disturbing frequency in this region due to the convergence of warm water and atmospheric instability. A water spout can form in minutes, sometimes with minimal warning, appearing as a funnel of rotating water and wind that extends from cloud base to ocean surface. They're not as powerful as land-based tornadoes typically, but they're more than powerful enough to capsize a yacht, shred sails, snap masts, and generally destroy anything in their path. The smaller ones might just scare you and cause some damage. The larger ones will flip your vessel like a toy and send you into the water with no time to grab emergency equipment or put on a life jacket or do any of the things you're supposed to do when abandoning ship. Survivors of waterspout encounters describe them as appearing almost instantaneously, going from calm conditions to violent rotating winds in the time it takes to realize what you're seeing. And by then it's too late to take effective evasive action because these things move fast and erratically, and your boat, even with engines at full power, can't outrun something traveling at 40 or 50 miles per hour. Let's talk about rogue waves, those statistical anomalies that oceanographers used to think were myths until satellite data and modern instrumentation proved they're absolutely real and more common than anyone wanted to believe. A rogue wave is a wave that's significantly larger than the surrounding wave field, sometimes more than twice the height of the waves around it, appearing seemingly out of nowhere and carrying enormous destructive energy. In the Bermuda Triangle, where multiple wave patterns from different weather systems can converge and reinforce each other, rogue waves are a documented hazard that has sunk vessels that should have been able to handle the prevailing sea conditions. Imagine you're in 8-foot seas, which are rough but manageable for a properly handled yacht, and suddenly a 25-foot wall of water appears ahead of you with no warning and no time to position your vessel to take it safely. That wave can roll you, pitch-pull you, or simply break over your deck with enough force to shatter cabin windows, flood interior spaces, and sink you in minutes. The wave doesn't even need to capsize you to be deadly. It just needs to cause enough damage that your vessel can no longer stay afloat, and then you're back to the life raft scenario we've been exploring. Except now you're starting from a worse position because you might be injured from the impact. You might have lost critical survival equipment, and you might be in shock from the speed and violence of the event. Let's talk about lightning, because this region sees some of the most intense electrical storm activity in the Atlantic. And lightning strikes on boats are more common than most recreational sailors realize. A direct lightning strike can fry every piece of electronic equipment on your vessel simultaneously, leaving you without GPS, without radio, without navigation lights, without engine controls if your engine is electronically managed, basically without any of the modern technology that makes ocean sailing safe and navigable. You're suddenly back to sailing like it's 1800, except you don't have the skills or knowledge that 18th century sailors had. And you're in a boat that was designed assuming you'd have electronics, which means it might not even be safely sailable using traditional methods. A lightning strike can also start fires, because it's delivering millions of volts of electricity into a structure that contains flammable materials like fuel, fabrics, and various petroleum products. A fire on a boat is terrifying in ways that land-based fires aren't, because there's no fire department coming, no way to evacuate to safety, Just you and whatever firefighting equipment you have aboard, trying to control flames while surrounded by water. That's both your potential salvation and your guaranteed death if you have to abandon a burning vessel. Let's talk about equipment failure, the boring, mundane, completely non-mysterious way that people get into fatal trouble in the Bermuda Triangle. Your engine quits, your rudder breaks, your steering cables part, your standing rigging fails. Any of these things can transform a routine passage into a survival situation, especially if they happen in challenging conditions or far from help. Modern sailboats are complex machines with hundreds of components that all need to work correctly for the vessel to be safely operated, and any one of those components can fail, often at the worst possible moment, often in ways that cascade into multiple system failures. Your engine overheats because the raw water cooling intake is clogged, which you don't notice until the engine seizes, which happens just as you're trying to maneuver through a narrow channel or avoid a collision or make progress against headwinds. Your autopilot fails, and you don't have the strength or stamina to hand steer for the duration of your passage. Your bilge pump quits, and you don't discover it until water has risen to dangerous levels. Your batteries fail, and you lose all electrical power. Any of these failures in isolation might be manageable, but they often don't occur in isolation. They occur in combinations or sequences where one failure causes or reveals another, and suddenly you're dealing with multiple critical problems simultaneously, while also trying to navigate and handle weather and maintain your own physical well-being. This is reality of ocean sailing that doesn't make for exciting television or mysterious disappearance theories. It's just systems breaking down, often at the worst possible times, often in ways that transform manageable situations into emergencies. The Bermuda Triangle doesn't need supernatural explanations when equipment failure, human error, and environmental challenges provide more than enough ways to kill unprepared or unlucky sailors. And here's the thing about all these different failure modes. They don't care about your preparation or your experience or your expensive equipment. They can happen to anyone at any time, often without warning. The only thing that changes is how you respond, how well you've prepared for emergencies, whether you have backup systems and redundancy and the knowledge to improvise solutions when your primary systems fail. Now, let's talk about what happens if you're not alone, if you're sailing with crew or family, because while solo survival is psychologically devastating, having other people with you creates a whole different category of challenges that can make survival harder rather than easier. You might think having multiple people means more hands to bail water, more eyes to watch for hazards, more brain power to solve problems. But it also means multiple people getting dehydrated at different rates, multiple people having different ideas about what to do next, multiple people experiencing fear and panic and making decisions driven by emotion rather than logic, multiple people whose declining physical and mental states you need to monitor and manage while also trying to maintain your own functionality. Let's say you're on that yacht with your spouse and 2 children when the storm hits and everything starts going wrong. Now, every decision you make isn't just about your own survival, but about keeping your family alive, which adds a layer of psychological pressure that makes rational decision-making even harder than it already is in an emergency. Your kids are terrified and seasick and crying, and you need to project calm and confidence you don't feel to keep them from complete panic. Your spouse is injured, maybe a broken arm or ribs from being thrown against a bulkhead during a particularly violent wave, and now you're dealing with pain management and potential shock on top of everything else. You're still bailing water, still fighting the storm, still trying to navigate, but now you're also playing field medic and child psychologist and crisis counselor, all while your own body is hypothermic and exhausted and failing. When it comes time to abandon ship, you can't just worry about getting yourself into the life raft. You need to get 4 people into that raft in conditions that made it dangerous even when you were doing it solo. And you need to do it while maintaining order and preventing panic. Because if everyone tries to board simultaneously, someone is going into the water, and in rough seas with exhaustion and hypothermia, going into the water is probably fatal. You're making triage decisions about what survival equipment to bring and what to leave behind, and those decisions are complicated by the fact that you need supplies for 4 people, not 1, which means either bringing less of everything or making multiple trips between the sinking yacht and the raft, each trip adding risk and burning time you might not have. And then you're in the raft, all 4 of you, and the space that seemed barely adequate for 1 person is now impossibly cramped with 4 bodies, and the water ration that might have kept you alive for 3 days solo needs to be divided by 4, giving each person less than a day's worth of fluids. And the psychological pressure of watching your children deteriorate from dehydration while you can do nothing to help them is a special kind of torture that solo survivors don't experience. You're making horrible calculations about water rationing, trying to decide if children need more water than adults because their bodies have less reserve capacity, or if adults need more water because they have larger body mass, or if everyone gets equal shares because anything else seems morally wrong, even if it's not the optimal survival strategy. You're watching your family suffer, and there's nothing you can do except enforce discipline about water consumption and hope that rescue arrives before the rationing calculations become moot, because everyone is too dehydrated to survive regardless of how the water is distributed. Let's talk about what happens when crew members disagree about survival strategy, because this is where group dynamics can turn deadly. 1 person wants to stay with the damaged yacht, another wants to abandon to the life raft immediately, a 3rd wants to try to sail toward the nearest land even though navigation is compromised and fuel is low. These aren't theoretical disagreements about the best approach. They're life or death decisions that need to be made quickly. And if the group can't reach consensus, or if someone decides to take unilateral action contrary to the group's decision, you can end up in situations where the group fractures, where some people abandon ship while others stay aboard, where coordination breaks down and everyone ends up worse off than if they'd stayed unified, even if they made a suboptimal choice. Leadership in a survival situation is about making decisions quickly with incomplete information and then getting everyone to commit to those decisions, even when they're scared and uncertain and maybe think a different approach would be better. If you're the nominal captain or trip leader, you're responsible for those decisions, and if they turn out wrong, you're responsible for the deaths that result, which is a psychological burden that can be as crippling as any physical injury. Let's talk about what happens when someone on your crew gives up, when they decide they can't continue fighting, can't continue bailing or navigating or maintaining hope, and they just stop. This is surprisingly common in extended survival situations, where 1 person reaches their breaking point and essentially shuts down, becoming a psychological and physical burden on the rest of the group who now need to compensate for the lost capacity. You can try to motivate them, to encourage them, to remind them of reasons to keep fighting, but if they're fundamentally broken by the experience, your efforts might not work, and then you're faced with a decision about how much of your own limited energy to spend trying to keep them engaged versus focusing on your own survival and the survival of others who are still fighting. This sounds cold, this calculus of abandoning crew members who've given up, but it's a reality of survival situations where resources are limited, and every calorie burned trying to motivate someone who won't respond is a calorie that could have been used for essential survival tasks. Groups can survive longer than individuals in theory because they have more capacity and redundancy, but in practice, groups often do worse because of coordination failures, interpersonal conflicts, and the psychological burden of watching people you care about suffer and die while being powerless to prevent it. The Bermuda Triangle doesn't care whether you're alone or in a group. It will kill you either way. The only question is whether having companions makes the journey to that end more bearable or more agonizing. And the answer to that question probably depends on who those companions are, how well you work together under stress, and whether you're lucky enough to all survive or unlucky enough to watch some survive while others don't. Let's get back to you alone in that life raft on day 4, because we need to discuss what happens when your body reaches the absolute limits of survival without water. Day 4 is when organ failure begins, when your kidneys start shutting down, not from any dramatic injury, but simply from the accumulated stress of trying to function without adequate fluids. Your urine, if you're still producing any, is dark brown, almost the color of cola, concentrated with waste products that your kidneys can't dilute because there's no water to work with. You might not even realize you've stopped urinating because your bladder is empty and your awareness of bodily functions is degraded. But that cessation of kidney function is a critical milestone that marks your transition from severe dehydration to acute kidney failure. Once your kidneys shut down completely, you've got maybe 48 hours before the accumulation of waste products in your blood causes fatal complications. Your brain is barely functioning at this point. You're having trouble forming coherent thoughts, trouble remembering basic information like your name or where you are or why you're in this raft. You might have brief moments of lucidity where everything seems clear and you understand your situation with painful accuracy, but those moments are separated by long periods of confused semi-consciousness where reality and hallucination blend together into a dreamlike state that might actually be your brain's mercy, protecting you from the full horror of your situation by denying you the awareness to comprehend it. You're seeing things that aren't there with complete conviction. You're having full conversations with people who don't exist. You're experiencing elaborate rescue scenarios that feel absolutely real until you suddenly realize you're still in the raft, still alone, still dying. The line between consciousness and unconsciousness is blurring, and you're spending more time in states that might be sleep or might be something more concerning, brief losses of consciousness that could be your brain shutting down non-essential functions to preserve whatever critical capacity remains. Your heart is struggling, working against blood that's thick and sluggish, trying to maintain pressure and circulation with inadequate fluid volume, and you might be experiencing chest pain or irregular heartbeats or palpitations that suggest your cardiac system is under catastrophic stress. Your body is cannibalizing itself at this point, breaking down muscle tissue to access water and nutrients that are stored in cellular structures, essentially consuming its own substance to maintain critical functions for a few more hours. This is the end stage of dehydration, and there's no recovering from this point without immediate medical intervention involving IV fluids and electrolyte replacement and probably dialysis to handle the kidney failure. Even if rescue arrived right now, your chances of survival are significantly reduced because of the damage your body has sustained over the past 4 days. You might survive the rescue only to die days or weeks later from organ damage that proves irreversible. But rescue isn't arriving. You're on day 4, and the search for you has probably been scaled back or suspended because the probability of finding survivors after 4 days in a life raft is low enough that rescue coordinators need to allocate their limited resources to more recent emergencies where survivors are more likely to be found alive. This isn't callousness, it's triage on a massive scale, the same kind of brutal calculation you'd make if you were in their position, but from your perspective in the raft, it feels like abandonment, like the world has forgotten you exist and has moved on without bothering to finish the search. Your EPIRB is probably still transmitting, assuming its battery hasn't failed, which means somewhere in a database your position is being updated, but position data doesn't mean rescue is coming. It just means your final location will be known when someone eventually processes the data and realizes you're no longer transmitting because you died and your EPIRB battery finally gave out, or because the raft deflated and sank, taking you with it. Let's talk about what dying of dehydration actually feels like, because this is important to understand if you want to appreciate why the Bermuda Triangle is genuinely dangerous rather than just mysterious. Dying of dehydration is not peaceful. It's not like falling asleep and not waking up. It's a gradual shutdown of all your systems, each one failing in sequence, each failure causing new and interesting forms of suffering. Your skin is cracked and painful. Your eyes are dry and burning. Your mouth is a desert. Your throat is swollen. Your stomach is cramping. Your muscles are seizing. Your head is pounding. Your heart is racing and irregular. You're experiencing waves of nausea and dizziness. You're confused and disoriented. You're hallucinating. You're experiencing terror and despair in waves that alternate with strange periods of calm acceptance. Your body is in crisis and it's making sure you're aware of it, right up until the point where your brain no longer has the capacity to process the signals your failing organs are sending. And then, finally, you lose consciousness for the last time. Your brain, starved of adequate blood flow and oxygen, begins shutting down higher functions. You might have a few last moments of awareness, confused impressions of orange fabric and motion and heat, and then nothing. Your heart continues beating for a while, struggling through increasingly difficult contractions, and then it stops. Not dramatically, not with any final surge, just a cessation of function when the cardiac muscle can no longer maintain the electrical impulse that drives the beat. And then you're gone, another casualty of the Bermuda Triangle that will be recorded as a missing person because your body, still in the raft or having fallen into the ocean when you lost consciousness, will never be recovered. The raft might eventually wash up on some shore months or years from now, sun-bleached and torn, with no indication of what happened to its occupant. Or it might sink, weighed down by water that leaked through damaged seams. Or it might drift indefinitely, a ghost raft, occasionally spotted by passing vessels who report an empty life raft floating in the shipping lanes, but who don't stop to investigate because empty rafts are common and there's nothing to be gained from recovering them. Now let's rewind again and explore yet another way your day in the Bermuda Triangle could end. because we've been focusing on slow deaths from dehydration and exposure, but the triangle offers plenty of opportunities for faster, more violent ends. Let's talk about collision, because this region is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, with massive cargo vessels transiting between the Americas and Europe, cruise ships carrying thousands of passengers, tankers hauling oil and chemicals, container ships stacked 10 stories high with goods. These vessels are enormous, often over 1,000 feet long, displacing tens of thousands of tons, traveling at speeds of 20 knots or more. And here's the critical thing: they often can't see you. Your 40-foot yacht, sitting low in the water, is almost invisible to the bridge of a container ship where the crew is hundreds of feet above the ocean surface, and looking ahead for hazards at their level, not down at the water where small vessels might be transiting. Modern ships rely on radar and AIS, automatic identification system, to detect other vessels and avoid collisions. But your yacht's radar signature is tiny, easily lost in sea clutter and wave returns. And if you don't have AIS installed, or if your AIS is turned off or malfunctioning, you're essentially invisible to the commercial traffic around you. At night, this becomes even more dangerous, because now the only way for a cargo ship to spot you is visually, and your navigation lights, which seem bright to you, are tiny pinpricks against the dark ocean that can easily be missed by a bridge crew that's monitoring instruments and managing systems and dealing with all the complex tasks of operating a large vessel. You might see the cargo ship approaching, might even try to alter course to avoid it, but if you're in its path and it hasn't seen you, your ability to maneuver out of the way depends on having enough time and space to execute the maneuver, and cargo ships at sea cover distance deceptively quickly. What looks like it's miles away and moving slowly is actually traveling at speeds that will bring it to your location in minutes, and cargo ships can't stop or turn quickly. A loaded container ship traveling at 20 knots needs miles of distance to come to a complete stop, and its turning radius is measured in thousands of feet. If the crew suddenly spots you on radar or visually realizes you're on a collision course, they might not be able to avoid you even if they take immediate evasive action. So you're sailing along in the dark, maybe a bit tired because you've been on watch for several hours, maybe not paying as much attention to your surroundings as you should be because everything has been routine and uneventful, and you look up to check the horizon and suddenly there's a massive wall of steel bearing down on you, lit up like a city, engines rumbling with power that dwarfs anything your yacht can produce, and you have seconds to react. You throw the wheel hard over, advance the throttles, try to turn away from the collision course, but it's too late. The bow of the cargo ship hits your yacht amidships with unstoppable force, and your vessel, which felt substantial and seaworthy, is crushed like an aluminum can under a boot. The impact is violent and instantaneous, throwing you across the cockpit, possibly into the water, possibly unconscious from hitting your head on something hard. If you're lucky, you're killed immediately by the impact. If you're unlucky, you're thrown into the water next to a massive ship that's churning the ocean into a maelstrom of propeller wash and turbulence, and you're sucked down into the vortex created by the ship's passage, pulled under by forces you can't resist, held down until your lungs give out and you drown in darkness, while the ship that killed you continues on its way, possibly not even aware that a collision occurred, because the impact of hitting a small yacht is barely noticeable to a vessel that size. The crew might have felt a slight bump, might have made a note in the log to check for damage when they reach port, might have reported a possible collision to maritime authorities who will investigate and find nothing because your yacht is already sinking and you're already dead, and there's no evidence on the surface to indicate what happened. This is how vessels vanish in the Bermuda Triangle without a trace, not through supernatural means, but through simple physics and the reality that the ocean is big enough and deep enough to swallow ships without leaving evidence that rescue teams can find. Let's talk about another quick death scenario: fire at sea. We mentioned earlier that lightning strikes can start fires, but fires can start from many other causes: fuel leaks, electrical faults, cooking accidents, mechanical failures, any number of mundane equipment malfunctions that on land would be minor inconveniences, but at sea can be catastrophic. A fire on a boat spreads fast because boats are full of flammable materials packed into small spaces, and once a fire gets established, fighting it with the limited firefighting equipment aboard a yacht is extremely difficult. You might have a few fire extinguishers, maybe a fire blanket, but that's designed to handle small, contained fires, not a serious blaze that's gotten into the boat's structure. If the fire reaches your fuel tanks, you're facing an explosion that will destroy the vessel and likely kill anyone aboard instantly. If it doesn't explode but burns hot enough, you're faced with a choice between staying aboard and being burned alive or jumping into the ocean to escape the flames. Neither option is good. The ocean might save you from burning to death, but now you're in the water without a life raft, without emergency equipment, possibly injured from the fire or from jumping, and your chances of survival are minimal unless rescue happens to be very close and very lucky. Most people who end up in the water unexpectedly without proper flotation or survival equipment die within hours from hypothermia or exhaustion, even in tropical waters where you'd think temperature wouldn't be a factor. Water conducts heat away from your body much faster than air, and even 80-degree water will eventually cause hypothermia if you're in it long enough. And hours of treading water burns calories and energy that you can't replace, and eventually your muscles fail and you can't keep your head above water and you drown despite your best efforts to stay afloat. Let's talk about aircraft, because while we've been focused on maritime disasters, the Bermuda Triangle has an equally impressive record of swallowing planes, and the challenges of surviving an aircraft incident over water are in many ways worse than surviving a maritime emergency. When a plane goes into the ocean, you've got seconds to react before impact, and those seconds need to be spent bracing for the crash and preparing for immediate evacuation, not contemplating your options or reviewing your emergency procedures. Aircraft ditching in the ocean, even when done by skilled pilots in relatively controlled circumstances, is violent and unpredictable. The plane might stay intact and float for a few minutes, giving passengers time to evacuate through exits and deploy life rafts. Or it might break apart on impact, scattering passengers and debris across a wide area of ocean where your chances of reaching flotation devices or other survivors are minimal. Or it might sink immediately, taking anyone who doesn't get out in the first few seconds down with it into depths from which there's no escape. Let's say you're on a small aircraft, maybe a private plane or a charter, flying between islands in the Bermuda Triangle region. It's a routine flight, weather looks good, and then something goes wrong. Engine failure, structural failure, control system failure, pilot incapacitation, any number of things that can cause a plane to go from flying normally to falling from the sky in seconds. The pilot is trying to maintain control, looking for somewhere to ditch, ideally in calm water where the impact might be survivable. But there's no good place to put down an aircraft on the ocean, just degrees of terrible. The pilot needs to touch down with the wings level, nose slightly up, at the minimum airspeed that maintains control, and they need to do this while probably dealing with emergency alarms and systems failures and their own very reasonable fear of imminent death. You're in the passenger compartment, maybe wearing your seatbelt because the turbulence light is on, or maybe not because you were comfortable and didn't think anything bad would happen. The pilot announces over the intercom that you're going to ditch in the ocean and you need to brace for impact. You've got maybe 30 seconds to process this information, to assume the brace position, to think about your family and whether you're going to survive the next minute. And then the plane hits the water. The impact is like hitting concrete, because water at high speed doesn't compress or displace fast enough to provide cushioning. It might as well be solid. The deceleration is brutal, measured in tens of Gs, throwing you against your seatbelt with force that can cause serious injury even if the aircraft stays intact. The noise is deafening, metal screeching and tearing, water rushing in through compromised seals and broken windows, the entire structure groaning under forces it was never designed to handle. And then, if you're conscious and uninjured and lucky, you've got to get out. Aircraft are not designed to float. Most will sink within minutes of ditching, and those minutes are filled with chaos. Passengers panicking, trying to exit through designated exits that might be blocked by structural damage or by other passengers, fighting against water that's already waist deep and rising, searching for life vests that are supposed to be under your seat but might have come loose during the impact. You need to get out of your seat, find the exit, get through it, inflate your life vest only after you're clear of the aircraft, because an inflated life vest will prevent you from submerging to swim under obstacles or through underwater exits. And you need to do all of this while the plane is sinking and tilting and filling with water and maybe on fire from fuel that's leaked and ignited. Most people who survive the initial impact of an aircraft ditching die in the evacuation, not because they made obvious mistakes, but because the circumstances are so chaotic and terrifying that even trained professionals struggle to maintain the presence of mind required to execute the procedures correctly. And if you do get out, if you make it to the surface and away from the sinking aircraft, now you're in the ocean, possibly injured, possibly without a life vest if you couldn't find yours, or if the inflation mechanism failed, definitely in shock from the experience, and you need to immediately start thinking about survival in a way that most plane passengers are completely unprepared for. Where's the life raft? Did anyone grab the emergency equipment? Are there other survivors? How long until rescue arrives? What direction is land? Should you stay near the crash site or try to swim toward shore? These are all questions you need to answer while treading water and fighting panic and dealing with injuries and the onset of hypothermia. The Bermuda Triangle is particularly unforgiving for aircraft crashes because of the depth of the water, which means the plane sinks into depths where recovery is nearly impossible, and because of the currents, which quickly disperse any floating debris or survivors, and because of the isolation, which means rescue might be hours or days away, depending on whether the aircraft got off a distress call before ditching and whether anyone knows where to look. Flight 19, which we mentioned earlier, is the archetypal example of how quickly aircraft can vanish in this region. 5 planes, 14 crew members, all gone within hours, with search and rescue finding almost nothing despite extensive efforts. The official explanation involves disorientation, navigation errors, fuel exhaustion, and ditching at night in rough seas, which would explain both why the planes were never found and why no survivors were recovered. But people prefer the mysterious explanation because it's more interesting than the reality that aircraft navigation in the 1940s was primitive by modern standards. That night, ditching in the ocean has a nearly zero survival rate, and that the Atlantic is very good at hiding wreckage and bodies. Modern aircraft have better navigation, better safety equipment, better emergency procedures, but they're still operating in the same unforgiving environment where mistakes are often fatal and where the ocean swallows evidence of those mistakes with casual efficiency. Now let's discuss something that doesn't get talked about much in Bermuda Triangle lore, but is actually one of the more common ways people get into serious trouble in this region. Simple, mundane human error, compounded by the unforgiving nature of the marine environment. You don't need methane bubbles or magnetic anomalies or supernatural forces to kill you when good old-fashioned mistakes will do the job perfectly well. Let's talk about fuel miscalculation, because this is embarrassingly common among recreational sailors and pilots who venture into the Bermuda Triangle region without properly accounting for consumption rates, reserve margins, and the impact of weather on fuel efficiency. You plan a passage based on optimal conditions, calm seas, favorable winds or currents, no detours or course changes. You calculate your fuel consumption based on your engine's published specifications, add what seems like a reasonable reserve, and head out confident that you've got plenty of fuel to reach your destination with gas to spare. But conditions aren't optimal. That favorable current you expected is actually running against you, costing you an extra knot of speed over ground. Those calm seas turned into 6-foot rollers that slow your progress and increase your engine's load. That direct course you planned had to be modified to avoid a weather system, adding 20 miles to your trip. Your engine's actual fuel consumption is higher than the published specifications because those specifications assume perfect maintenance and optimal operating conditions, and your engine hasn't been professionally serviced in 2 years and has accumulated deposits and worn components that increase fuel consumption. Individually, none of these factors seem significant. Collectively, they mean you're going to run out of fuel before you reach your destination, and once your engine quits, you're at the mercy of wind and current, which in the Bermuda Triangle means you're probably being pushed away from land toward the open Atlantic, where rescue becomes progressively less likely. Running out of fuel doesn't sink your vessel immediately, but it leaves you unable to maneuver, unable to maintain your position, unable to make way toward safety, basically transforming your powered yacht into a drifting derelict that's subject to whatever the ocean decides to do with it. If you're lucky, you've got sails and the wind is favorable and you can make progress toward land under sail alone, though this requires sailing skills that many modern powerboat operators don't have. If you're unlucky, you're drifting into shipping lanes or toward dangerous reefs, or simply out to sea where your food and water will run out long before you drift close enough to land to be rescued. Let's talk about navigation errors, which seem almost impossible in the age of GPS but remain surprisingly common because people over-rely on technology without understanding its limitations or maintaining backup systems. Your GPS fails. Battery dies, hardware malfunction, software glitch, user error, any number of reasons. Suddenly your navigating by compass and dead reckoning, skills that most modern sailors have never really practiced because GPS has always been there. You're trying to maintain a course without really understanding how to compensate for current and wind drift, how to take accurate bearings on visible landmarks, how to estimate your position using traditional techniques. You're making mistakes with compass readings, not properly accounting for magnetic variation, confusing true bearings with magnetic bearings, and every hour these small errors compound until you're miles off course without realizing it. By the time you figure out you're lost, you've burned fuel going the wrong direction, you've missed your planned landfall, and now you're trying to navigate to an alternate destination while also dealing with the psychological stress of realizing you have no idea where you are and your electronic navigation has failed. Or let's talk about weather routing errors, where you make decisions about when to depart and what route to take based on incomplete or misunderstood weather information. You look at a weather forecast and see acceptable conditions for your departure time, but you don't really understand how to read weather patterns, don't recognize that the forecast is showing the early stages of a developing system that's going to intensify, don't appreciate that weather in the Bermuda Triangle can change faster than forecast models can predict. You depart into conditions that look manageable but that deteriorate rapidly into the kind of life-threatening scenarios we've been discussing. Or you choose a route that seems shorter and more direct but that takes you through an area known for difficult conditions. And you make that choice because you don't have the local knowledge or experience to understand why the longer route around that area is actually the safer and smarter choice. Human error kills people in the Bermuda Triangle, not through single catastrophic mistakes, but through sequences of small poor decisions that accumulate into situations where survival becomes unlikely. You chose the wrong day to depart. You brought insufficient fuel reserves. You didn't check your emergency equipment. You didn't file a float plan with anyone who would notice if you went missing. You didn't understand your vessel's limitations. You didn't have the skills to handle the emergency when it developed. You didn't call for help soon enough when things started going wrong. You made decisions based on optimism rather than caution. You assumed that modern technology would protect you from the kind of maritime disasters that killed sailors in previous centuries. Each individual decision seems reasonable at the time, but collectively they create a situation where you're fighting for survival in an environment that has killed thousands of people throughout history and will continue killing people long into the future. The ocean doesn't grade on a curve. It doesn't care that you're doing your best with limited knowledge and experience. It doesn't give you credit for having good intentions or expensive equipment. It just applies physics and biology relentlessly until either you survive or you don't. And your survival has more to do with whether you made the right decisions and got lucky than with any inherent fairness or mercy in the universe. This is the reality of the Bermuda Triangle that conspiracy theories and supernatural explanations obscure. It's not a mysterious death zone where normal rules don't apply. It's a heavily trafficked area of ocean where people who make mistakes or encounter bad luck face consequences that are often fatal because the ocean is unforgiving and rescue is uncertain and survival requires not just knowledge and preparation, but also luck that you can't control or predict. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture of why the Bermuda Triangle has this reputation for swallowing vessels and aircraft when statistically it's no more dangerous than many other heavily trafficked ocean areas. The answer lies in human psychology and our relationship with mystery, because we're wired to find patterns and create narratives even when the data doesn't support them. The Bermuda Triangle became famous not because of any inherent supernatural properties, but because a writer named Vincent Gaddis coined the term in a 1964 magazine article, and then subsequent writers built on that foundation, adding more alleged incidents, embellishing details, connecting unrelated events into a pattern that suggested something mysterious was happening. This is how legends are born. Someone creates a compelling narrative, other people add to it because compelling narratives sell books and generate attention. And eventually you have a mythology that's completely divorced from the statistical reality. Let's look at the actual numbers because they're instructive. The Bermuda Triangle, depending on how you define its boundaries, covers roughly 500,000 to 1.5 million square miles of ocean. This is one of the most heavily trafficked maritime and aviation corridors in the world, with thousands of vessels and aircraft passing through annually, probably tens of thousands if you count all commercial, military, and recreational traffic. Given that volume of traffic, the number of incidents that occur in this region is actually pretty average compared to other heavily trafficked areas. Ships sink, planes crash, people go missing at sea. This happens everywhere in the world's oceans, not just in the Bermuda Triangle. But because this region has been branded as mysterious, every incident that occurs here gets added to the legend, while similar incidents in other parts of the ocean are just recorded as normal maritime casualties that don't generate conspiracy theories or late-night documentaries. The U.S. Coast Guard, which handles search and rescue in this region and would presumably know if there was something genuinely anomalous happening, has repeatedly stated that the Bermuda Triangle is no more dangerous than any other part of the ocean. Insurance companies, which are intensely interested in actual risk assessment because it affects their bottom line, don't charge higher premiums for vessels or aircraft transiting this region, which they certainly would if the statistical data suggested elevated risk. Lloyd's of London, which has been insuring maritime traffic for centuries and has probably the best historical data on shipping losses, doesn't recognize the Bermuda Triangle as a particularly hazardous area. So if the people whose jobs and profits depend on accurate risk assessment aren't concerned about the Bermuda Triangle, why does the legend persist? Because mystery is more interesting than reality. Because supernatural explanations are more emotionally satisfying than boring technical ones. Because admitting that the ocean is dangerous everywhere and that human error and equipment failure and bad weather kill people regardless of what geographic region they're in doesn't make for compelling entertainment. The Bermuda Triangle legend persists because it serves psychological and commercial needs that have nothing to do with actual maritime safety. It gives people something to speculate about, something to debate, something to feel knowledgeable about when they cite the famous cases and mysterious circumstances. It sells books and generates documentary programming and creates tourism revenue for the region. It provides a simple explanation for complex events that involve multiple contributing factors and technical details that most people don't understand or find interesting. Let's examine some of the most famous Bermuda Triangle cases and see how they fall apart under scrutiny. The USS Cyclops, a massive Navy cargo ship that disappeared in 1918 with 306 crew members, is often cited as proof of the Triangle's mysterious nature. But the Cyclops was overloaded, had known structural problems, was captained by an officer with documented behavioral issues, and disappeared during a period of rough weather. The ship was probably lost to structural failure and sinking in heavy seas, which explains why no distress signal was sent and why no wreckage was found in an era before sophisticated search equipment existed. No mystery required. just a combination of overloading, structural weakness, and bad weather. The disappearance of the Marine Sulphur Queen in 1963 is another frequently cited case. This was a tanker converted to carry molten sulfur at high temperatures, a conversion that created structural stresses and hazards that the original design hadn't accounted for. The ship had documented structural problems, cracks in the hull, and concerns about seaworthiness that were noted before its final voyage. It disappeared in weather conditions that, while not extreme, were challenging enough that a structurally compromised vessel might have foundered. Again, no mystery, just poor maintenance and questionable conversion design meeting unfortunate weather. Flight 19 we've already discussed, but it bears repeating that the official investigation concluded that the flight leader became disoriented, led the formation in the wrong direction, and they ran out of fuel and ditched at night in the ocean. The radio transcripts support this explanation completely, showing a progressive loss of situational awareness and increasing confusion. The mariner search plane that disappeared while looking for them was a known fire hazard that was seen exploding in flight that night. Two separate incidents, both explainable by known factors. No supernatural intervention required. But here's the thing. Even when you explain these cases with mundane causes, people often prefer the mysterious version because it's more interesting. Because admitting that the Bermuda Triangle is just ocean with no special properties means giving up a cherished belief, means accepting that the world is perhaps less mysterious and more mundane than we'd like it to be. And there's something deeply human about that preference for mystery over explanation, for narrative over statistics, for believing that there are still unexplained phenomena in a world that science has mapped and measured and explained in increasingly comprehensive detail. But let's be fair to the Bermuda Triangle for a moment and acknowledge that while it's not supernatural, it does have some genuinely challenging characteristics that make it more difficult to navigate safely than some other ocean regions, even if those characteristics don't rise to the level of making it statistically more dangerous. The weather in this region is legitimately unpredictable and can be violent, with the convergence of multiple weather systems creating conditions that are hard to forecast accurately. The Gulf Stream creates navigation challenges that can catch inexperienced sailors off guard. The depth of the water in many areas makes recovery of wreckage nearly impossible, which contributes to the sense of mystery when vessels vanish without a trace. The sheer volume of traffic means that collisions and near misses are more common than in less traveled waters. The presence of shallow reefs and banks creates navigation hazards that have destroyed countless vessels over the centuries. These are all real factors that require respect and preparation, even if they don't require belief in supernatural forces. So when we say the Bermuda Triangle isn't mysterious, we're not saying it's safe or easy to navigate. We're saying that the dangers it presents are explainable by known physical phenomena and that the accident rate is consistent with what you'd expect given the traffic volume and environmental conditions. You can die in the Bermuda Triangle, absolutely. You can get into serious trouble there, face life-threatening emergencies, experience the kind of maritime disasters we've been discussing throughout this exploration, but you're not going to die because of alien abductions or interdimensional portals or any of the other exotic explanations that have been proposed over the years. You're going to die because of weather or equipment failure or human error or simple bad luck, the same reasons people die in every other part of the world's oceans. The question then becomes, if the Bermuda Triangle is just a normal patch of ocean with normal levels of danger, why are we spending all this time talking about it? because understanding why the legend exists is actually more interesting than the legend itself, and because the real dangers of ocean travel, the mundane but deadly challenges of navigating open water, are worth understanding even if they're not as exciting as mysterious disappearances. Let's talk about what you actually need to survive in the Bermuda Triangle. Not supernatural protection or special equipment, but basic maritime competence and preparation. You need to understand weather patterns and how to read forecasts and when to delay departure because conditions are deteriorating. You need to maintain your equipment properly, not just assuming it will work when you need it, but actually testing systems and replacing worn components before they fail at critical moments. You need to have backup systems for critical functions, redundancy that gives you options when primary systems fail. You need to file float plans so that if you do go missing, someone knows where to start looking and when to be concerned. You need to carry proper emergency equipment and know how to use it, not just having an EPIRB and life raft aboard, but actually understanding deployment procedures and survival techniques. You need to be conservative in your planning, building in margins for error, assuming that conditions will be worse than forecast and that things will take longer than calculated. You need to know your own limitations and your vessel's limitations and operate within them rather than pushing boundaries because you're confident or impatient or trying to impress someone. You need to be willing to call for help early when things start going wrong rather than waiting until you're certain you need rescue because by the time you're certain, rescue might not be possible. You need to treat the ocean with the respect it deserves, acknowledging that it's been killing people for thousands of years and will continue doing so regardless of how much technology or confidence you bring to the encounter. These are not exciting recommendations. They don't involve special knowledge about electromagnetic anomalies or techniques for avoiding mysterious disappearances. They're boring, practical, unglamorous advice about preparation and caution and respect for an environment that's fundamentally hostile to human life. But this boring advice will keep you alive in the Bermuda Triangle more reliably than any amount of speculation about supernatural forces. Because the triangle isn't mysterious. It's just dangerous in exactly the same ways that all ocean environments are dangerous. If you approach it with appropriate preparation and respect, your chances of survival are good. If you approach it with overconfidence or inadequate preparation or bad decision-making, your chances of becoming another statistic in the legend are significantly higher. The choice is yours, but the ocean doesn't care which choice you make. It's going to apply the same physics and biology, regardless of whether you believe in the mystery or understand the mundane reality. Let's acknowledge something else. There's a certain arrogance in assuming that the Bermuda Triangle needs to be mysterious, that normal explanations aren't sufficient to account for the incidents that occur there. It's almost insulting to the people who've died in these waters to suggest that their deaths require supernatural explanation, as if human error and equipment failure and bad weather aren't sufficient reasons for maritime disaster. Every person who died in the Bermuda Triangle died for specific, explicable reasons, and dismissing those reasons in favor of mystery diminishes the real challenges they faced and the real circumstances that led to their deaths. The sailor who died from dehydration in a life raft didn't die because of mysterious forces. They died because the ocean is hostile and rescue couldn't reach them in time. The pilot who ditched in the ocean and didn't survive didn't die because of alien intervention. They died because water landings are violent and survival rates are low. The crew of a vessel that sank in a storm didn't die mysteriously. They died because Storms are dangerous and ships sometimes aren't strong enough to survive them. These are real deaths with real explanations, and treating them as mysterious does a disservice to the people who experience them and to our understanding of maritime safety. Now let's circle back to the survival scenarios we've been exploring and talk about the people who actually do survive emergencies in the Bermuda Triangle. Because while we've focused extensively on ways to die, plenty of people encounter serious problems in this region and live to tell about it, and understanding what separates survivors from casualties is instructive. The difference usually comes down to a few key factors: preparation, decision-making under stress, physical condition, mental resilience, and luck. Let's examine each of these and understand how they interact to determine outcomes. Preparation means more than just having the right equipment aboard. It means having equipment that's properly maintained and that you actually know how to use under stress. It means having practiced emergency procedures before you need them in real conditions. It means having thought through various failure scenarios and developed responses so that when something goes wrong, you're executing a plan rather than improvising desperately. The sailors who survive tend to be the ones who've spent time thinking about what could go wrong and how they'd handle it, who've rehearsed deploying their life raft in calm conditions so they know the procedure, who've tested their EPIRB to verify it works, who've practiced man overboard procedures until they're automatic. This preparation creates muscle memory and mental frameworks that function even when stress and panic are degrading cognitive function. When your boat is sinking and you need to evacuate, you don't have time to read the life raft instructions. You need to already know them so well that your hands can execute the deployment while your conscious mind is dealing with other urgent tasks. Decision-making under stress is a skill that's hard to teach but critical to survival. It involves maintaining enough calm to evaluate options rationally even when circumstances are terrifying, avoiding the paralysis that comes from being overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crisis,
and being willing to make imperfect decisions quickly, rather than waiting for perfect information that might never arrive. Survivors often describe a strange sense of detachment during emergencies,
an ability to observe their situation from a slightly removed perspective that allows them to think clearly about problems and solutions rather than being consumed by fear and panic. This isn't something most people possess naturally. It's usually developed through exposure to stressful situations, through training that simulates emergencies, through consciously practicing remaining calm when circumstances would normally trigger panic. The sailors who survive are often the ones who can look at a sinking vessel and think systematically about what needs to happen next, rather than freezing or acting impulsively. They prioritize critical tasks, they maintain situational awareness, they adjust their plans as circumstances change, and they keep functioning effectively even when their bodies are screaming at them to panic. Physical condition matters more than most people realize. We've discussed how exhaustion and hypothermia and dehydration degrade your ability to perform tasks and make decisions. And the corollary is that people who are in better physical condition have more reserves to draw on when emergencies push their bodies to the limit. The person who's physically fit can bail water longer, can maintain body temperature better in cold conditions, can function longer without food and water. This doesn't mean you need to be an athlete to survive at sea, but it does mean that your baseline physical condition is going to affect your survival margin when things go wrong. The difference between surviving and dying in a life raft might come down to whether you have enough strength left after 3 days of dehydration to signal a passing aircraft, or whether you have enough core body strength to maintain a functional position despite seasickness and exhaustion. Mental resilience. The ability to maintain hope and purpose even when circumstances seem hopeless is perhaps the most important survival factor and also the hardest to quantify or develop deliberately. Survivors often talk about having something to live for, some person or purpose or future event that gave them a reason to keep fighting when surrender would have been easier. They talk about setting small goals, breaking survival down into manageable chunks rather than being overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. Instead of thinking, I need to survive 4 days until rescue arrives, they think I need to survive the next hour, and then when that hour passes, they set a goal for the next hour. This technique of chunking time into survivable segments helps maintain mental function and prevents the despair that leads to giving up. Mental resilience also involves being able to cope with discomfort and suffering without letting it break your will to continue. Pain and misery are inevitable in survival situations, and people who can experience significant suffering without interpreting it as a signal to surrender have better survival odds than people who need comfort and safety to maintain psychological stability. And then there's luck, the factor you can't control or improve through preparation, being in the right place when a rescue aircraft happens to pass by, having your emergency happen on a day when weather allows rescue operations rather than on a day when seas are too rough for helicopters to fly, having your vessel's critical failure occur close to shipping lanes rather than in empty ocean, not being in the path of a rogue wave or waterspout, not having multiple systems fail simultaneously. Luck is the randomness that determines whether identical preparation and identical responses lead to survival or death. And acknowledging the role of luck is important because it keeps you humble about survival and reminds you that even perfect preparation doesn't guarantee success. Many people have died in the Bermuda Triangle despite doing everything right, and some people have survived despite making serious mistakes, and the difference often comes down to factors beyond anyone's control. The survivors we tend to hear about are the ones whose stories validate our beliefs about preparation and skill mattering, but for every survivor who can point to specific decisions and preparations that saved them, there are casualties who made the same decisions and preparations but encountered circumstances that overwhelmed even optimal responses. Let's talk about modern technology and how it's changed survival odds in the Bermuda Triangle. Because while the fundamental dangers remain the same, the tools available for prevention, communication, and rescue have improved dramatically over the past few decades, and understanding these improvements helps contextualize why more recent disappearances are actually rarer despite increased traffic. GPS has revolutionized navigation to a degree that's hard to overstate if you've never tried to navigate without it. Before GPS, determining your position at sea required celestial navigation with a sextant, dead reckoning with compass and speed calculations, or radio navigation aids that had limited range and accuracy. All of these methods were subject to significant errors, especially in conditions where you couldn't see the sun or stars for celestial shots, or when currents and winds were affecting your actual track in ways you couldn't accurately measure. GPS gives you your position accurate to within a few meters, updated continuously, with no skill required beyond knowing how to read the display. This virtually eliminates the kind of navigation errors that caused Flight 19 to get lost and run out of fuel over the ocean. You still need to account for things like magnetic variation and current effects on your course, but at least you always know where you are, which is a huge advantage that previous generations of navigators didn't have. EPIRB technology has evolved to the point where modern beacons not only transmit distress signals but include GPS coordinates in the transmission, meaning rescue coordinators know exactly where you are rather than having to rely on satellite Doppler positioning that could have errors of miles. The accuracy of modern EPIRBs dramatically reduces search areas and increases the probability that rescue teams can find you before you die from exposure or dehydration. Modern beacons also have better battery life, more reliable activation mechanisms, and stronger signals that satellite systems can detect more reliably. Satellite communication has made it possible to maintain contact with shore even when you're hundreds of miles offshore, which means you can receive updated weather information, report problems before they become emergencies, and coordinate with rescue services in real time rather than hoping your distress signal is being received and acted upon. Satellite phones, while expensive, provide a communication capability that's essentially global, allowing you to call for help from anywhere on the ocean and to receive instructions and support from experts who can guide you through emergency procedures. Weather forecasting has improved to the point where truly surprise storms are much rarer than they were even 20 years ago. Modern meteorology uses satellite data, computer models, and vast sensor networks to predict weather with accuracy that would have seemed magical to sailors in previous generations. The storms that form with little warning are still dangerous, but they're less likely to be completely unanticipated if you're paying attention to forecasts and updates. You still need to be able to interpret weather information correctly, but at least the information is available and relatively accurate for time frames of several days out. Vessel construction and design have improved with modern materials and engineering, creating boats that are stronger, more seaworthy, and less likely to suffer catastrophic structural failures than vessels built 50 or 100 years ago. Modern sailboats have positive flotation, meaning they won't sink even if completely flooded, which gives you more time to be rescued even if the vessel is no longer functional. Safety equipment has been standardized and improved, with regulations requiring specific equipment for offshore passages, and manufacturing quality has improved to the point where equipment is more likely to work when you need it. Life rafts are more reliable, easier to deploy, better equipped with survival supplies. Life jackets are more comfortable and effective. Emergency signaling devices are brighter and more visible. Firefighting equipment is more effective. Medical supplies are more comprehensive. All of this adds up to better survival odds when things go wrong. Search and rescue capabilities have improved dramatically, with Coast Guard and civilian rescue organizations having better equipment, better training, better coordination, and better technology for locating and recovering people in distress. Rescue helicopters have longer range and can operate in worse weather. Rescue swimmers are better trained and equipped. Coordination between different rescue organizations and commercial vessels is more effective. The time from distress signal to rescue arrival has decreased significantly for most scenarios. Despite all these improvements, people still die in the Bermuda Triangle, which tells you something about the fundamental challenges of ocean survival. Technology has made it safer, but it hasn't made it safe. The ocean is still hostile to human life. Equipment still fails. People still make mistakes. Weather still kills. The margin for error has increased. The probability of rescue has improved. But the underlying reality remains. If you get into serious enough trouble, far enough from help, you might not survive regardless of how good your equipment is or how well trained the rescue services are. The improvements in technology and rescue capabilities mean that more marginal situations now have survivable outcomes, but the really serious emergencies, the ones where multiple systems fail simultaneously, or where weather prevents rescue operations, or where the vessel sinks before evacuation can be completed, those still kill people with depressing regularity. The Bermuda Triangle in 2025 is safer than it was in 1945 or 1965, but it's still dangerous enough that treating it with casual disregard will get you killed. The modern sailor or pilot who ventures into this region with the assumption that technology will save them from their own poor decisions is making a potentially fatal mistake. Technology provides tools and capabilities that improve your odds, but it doesn't replace judgment, skill, preparation, or respect for the environment. The GPS doesn't help you if you don't understand that you need to account for current. The EPIRB doesn't help you if you wait too long to activate it. The satellite phone doesn't help you if you're unconscious from hitting your head during a collision. The improved weather forecasting doesn't help you if you don't check the forecast or don't understand how to interpret it. The better rescue capabilities don't help you if you're in conditions where rescue operations can't safely be conducted. Technology is a multiplier on competence, not a replacement for it. So here we are, 25 chapters deep, into exploring why you wouldn't survive a day in the Bermuda Triangle, and the answer should be clear by now, not because of anything mysterious or supernatural, but because the ocean is fundamentally hostile to human survival, and this particular patch of ocean combines heavy traffic, challenging weather, strong currents, significant depth, and all the normal hazards of maritime travel in a way that's killed thousands of people throughout history and will continue killing people into the future. The Bermuda Triangle doesn't need mysterious explanations. It just needs to be the ocean doing what the ocean has always done, which is test humans who venture onto its surface and kill the ones who aren't prepared or skilled or lucky enough to survive its challenges. Let's bring this back to you, the hypothetical person who started this journey floating on a yacht in beautiful Caribbean waters, admiring the view, confident in your preparations and your ability to handle whatever the triangle might throw at you. By now you understand, or should understand, that confidence without competence is a recipe for disaster, that the ocean doesn't grade on effort or intentions, that survival requires not just knowledge and equipment, but also humility about how quickly things can go catastrophically wrong. You understand that the storm can appear faster than you think possible, that your fuel calculations can be wrong, that your equipment can fail, that your navigation can be off, that your physical and mental reserves can be depleted more quickly than you ever imagined. You understand that the life raft is not a safe alternative to your vessel, but a desperate last resort with its own set of lethal challenges. You understand that rescue is not guaranteed, that search and rescue teams are doing their best but are constrained by physics and resources, and the simple fact that the ocean is vast and you are small. You understand that death in the Bermuda Triangle is not mysterious but mundane, not supernatural but statistical, not unique but entirely typical of what happens to people who venture onto the ocean without adequate respect for its dangers. So what should you take away from this exploration? First, respect. The ocean in general and the Bermuda Triangle specifically deserve your respect, not your fear or your superstitious belief in mysterious forces, but your recognition that you're entering an environment that has killed better sailors than you and will continue doing so long after you're gone. Respect means taking preparation seriously, means maintaining your equipment properly, means practicing emergency procedures, means checking weather forecasts, means filing float plans, means having backup systems, means knowing your limitations and operating within them. Respect means being conservative in your planning, building in margins for error, assuming things will be harder than expected. Respect means being willing to delay departure when conditions aren't optimal, being willing to divert to safety when problems develop, being willing to call for help early rather than waiting until you're certain you need rescue. Second, knowledge. Understanding the actual dangers of the Bermuda Triangle, the real challenges of ocean navigation and survival, is more valuable than believing in mysterious forces or supernatural explanations. Knowledge means understanding weather patterns, current effects, navigation principles, emergency procedures, survival techniques. Knowledge means studying accident reports and learning from the mistakes of others rather than assuming those mistakes won't happen to you. Knowledge means understanding your vessel's systems and capabilities, understanding your own physical and mental limitations, understanding the difference between confidence and competence. Knowledge is the foundation of preparation, and preparation is what separates survivors from casualties in most emergency situations. Third, humility. Accept that even with perfect preparation and comprehensive knowledge, you might still die in the Bermuda Triangle because luck plays a role that you can't control. Accept that the ocean is more powerful than you are, that nature is indifferent to your survival, that the universe doesn't owe you a happy ending just because you tried hard and meant well. Humility means acknowledging what you don't know, being willing to learn from others who have more experience, being willing to admit when you're in over your head and need help. Humility means treating every voyage as potentially dangerous rather than assuming familiarity has made you immune to risk. Humility means understanding that the Bermuda Triangle has killed experienced sailors and pilots as well as novices. That expertise increases your odds but doesn't guarantee survival. That every time you venture onto the ocean, you're accepting a level of risk that could result in your death regardless of how well prepared you are. Fourth, realism. The Bermuda Triangle is not a death zone where survival is impossible, but it's also not a safe playground where modern technology has eliminated risk. It's a challenging environment that requires competence and respect and preparation, and even then survival is not guaranteed. Realism means understanding that most of the time things will go fine, but occasionally things will go catastrophically wrong. And your survival in those catastrophic situations depends on factors that include, but aren't limited to, your preparation, your decision-making, your physical condition, your mental resilience, and your luck. Realism means planning for the worst while hoping for the best, means having equipment and skills you hope never to use, but that might save your life if circumstances demand them. Realism means accepting that every voyage into the Bermuda Triangle carries some probability of death, and that probability can be reduced but never eliminated completely. And finally, perspective. The Bermuda Triangle is dangerous, but so is every other part of the world's oceans. The dangers we've discussed, the scenarios we've explored, the ways you could die, these aren't unique to this region. They're universal challenges of maritime travel that apply anywhere you venture onto open water. The Bermuda Triangle is famous because someone gave it a catchy name and built a mythology around it, but the actual dangers are the same dangers that exist in the North Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, anywhere that humans take fragile vessels onto an environment that's fundamentally hostile to our survival. The lesson isn't avoid the Bermuda Triangle because it's mysteriously dangerous. The lesson is respect the ocean everywhere because it's straightforwardly dangerous in ways that are well understood and reliably fatal to people who don't take those dangers seriously. The triangle is a metaphor for the ocean in general, a convenient geographic focus for discussing dangers that are actually universal. Understanding why you wouldn't survive a day in the Bermuda Triangle is really understanding why ocean survival is hard everywhere, why maritime disasters happen, why people die at sea despite modern technology and comprehensive preparation. Now, let's address one final aspect of the Bermuda Triangle that we haven't fully explored, the cultural and psychological impact of the legend itself, because the myth has consequences beyond just generating entertainment and tourism revenue. The Bermuda Triangle legend has shaped how millions of people think about maritime safety, ocean dangers, and the relationship between humans and the natural world. And not all of those impacts have been positive. On one hand, the legend has made people aware that ocean travel carries risks, that vessels and aircraft can disappear, that rescue is not always possible. This awareness might have encouraged some people to take maritime safety more seriously, to invest in better equipment, to get proper training, to approach ocean travel with appropriate caution. If the Bermuda Triangle myth makes someone check their emergency beacon before departure or file a float plan they otherwise wouldn't have filed, then the legend has had a positive effect, even though the reasoning behind that caution is based on false premises. On the other hand, the legend has also encouraged exactly the wrong kind of thinking about maritime danger, focusing attention on mysterious explanations and supernatural forces rather than on the mundane but critical factors that actually determine survival. Someone who believes the Bermuda Triangle is dangerous because of electromagnetic anomalies might focus on having special navigational equipment to counter those anomalies rather than on having proper weather forecasting tools and the knowledge to use them effectively. Someone who believes the triangle is cursed or haunted might approach it with superstitious dread that doesn't translate into practical preparation, or might avoid it entirely and take riskier routes around it that actually expose them to greater danger. The legend encourages people to think about the Bermuda Triangle as unique, when the real lesson should be that all ocean environments require respect and preparation. It creates a false sense of security about other regions, as if the dangers we've been discussing are somehow contained within this one triangular area, rather than being universal characteristics of ocean travel. Someone might transit the Bermuda Triangle with extreme caution and appropriate respect for the dangers, but then treat a passage through the North Atlantic or the Pacific with casual disregard because those regions don't have mysterious reputations, when in fact they're just as dangerous and require the same level of preparation and respect. The cultural impact of the legend extends beyond individual decision-making to influence how institutions and systems approach maritime safety. Resources that could be spent on educating sailors about actual dangers and effective preparation might instead be spent on debunking supernatural theories or dealing with the public relations aspects of the legend. Every time a vessel or aircraft disappears in the Bermuda Triangle, media coverage focuses on the mysterious angle rather than on investigating the actual causes and learning lessons that could prevent future incidents. This isn't just annoying, it's actively harmful to maritime safety because it prevents the kind of clear-eyed analysis of accidents that leads to improvements in equipment, procedures, and regulations. The legend also affects how people perceive risk and evaluate evidence. When something goes wrong in the Bermuda Triangle, people are primed to see it as confirmation of the legend rather than as a normal maritime casualty that happens to have occurred in a region that gets special attention. This confirmation bias reinforces the legend and makes it resistant to contrary evidence, because every incident that supports the legend is remembered and discussed, while the thousands of uneventful transits through the region are ignored as uninteresting. This selective attention to negative outcomes while ignoring positive outcomes is a cognitive bias that affects human decision-making in many contexts, but the Bermuda Triangle legend crystallizes it in a particularly clear example of how mythology can persist despite overwhelming statistical evidence to the contrary. Let's consider how the legend affects the families of people who have died in the Bermuda Triangle, because this is where the human cost of the mythology becomes most apparent. When someone dies in a maritime accident, their family deserves to know what happened, to understand the causes, to have closure about the circumstances of their loved one's death. But when that death occurs in the Bermuda Triangle, the family has to deal not just with their grief, but also with the public's fascination with the mystery, with media speculation about supernatural causes, with conspiracy theorists and legend enthusiasts treating their tragedy as evidence for exotic theories, instead of their loved one's death being treated as what it is, a maritime casualty with explainable causes that might have been prevented by different decisions or different circumstances. It becomes part of a legend, mythologized and sensationalized in ways that add to the family's pain. The families of Flight 19 crew members had to deal with decades of speculation about alien abductions and interdimensional portals when the reality that their loved ones became disoriented and ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean at night is tragic enough without embellishment. Every time a new book or documentary perpetuates the legend, those families are reminded that their personal tragedy has been appropriated as entertainment and pseudoscientific speculation. This is one of the more overlooked costs of the Bermuda Triangle mythology. It dehumanizes the people who've died there, reducing them to data points in a mysterious pattern rather than individuals with families and stories and lives that were cut short by explicable circumstances. The legend also has implications for how we think about the unknown and how we process fear of the ocean. Humans are uncomfortable with uncertainty, with the idea that bad things can happen randomly without deeper meaning or purpose. The Bermuda Triangle legend provides a narrative structure that makes maritime disasters seem less random, suggesting that there's some organizing principle or mysterious force at work, rather than just the chaotic interaction of weather, waves, human error, and mechanical failure. This is psychologically comforting in a weird way, because it suggests that if you just avoid the triangle or understand its mysteries, you can be safe, whereas the reality that maritime disasters can happen anywhere and that even perfect preparation doesn't guarantee survival is much more unsettling. The legend allows people to believe in controllability where none really exists, to imagine that maritime danger has boundaries and rules, when really it's just physics and biology and statistics operating indifferently wherever humans venture onto the ocean. Understanding these cultural and psychological aspects of the legend is important because it helps explain why the Bermuda Triangle mythology persists despite being repeatedly debunked, and it highlights how narratives and beliefs can be more powerful than facts and evidence when it comes to shaping human behavior and institutional responses. Let's talk about one more dimension of Bermuda Triangle survival that encompasses everything we've discussed. The timeline of a typical maritime emergency in this region walking through hour by hour what happens as a situation deteriorates from routine to concerning to critical to fatal, because understanding this progression helps contextualize all the individual hazards and challenges we've explored. Hour 0, you're sailing in good conditions, everything is working as expected, and you have no indication that anything will go wrong. This is the point where prevention matters most, where proper pre-departure planning, equipment maintenance, weather monitoring, and conservative decision-making can prevent the emergency from ever occurring. Most people who die in maritime emergencies make the crucial mistakes during this phase, not through dramatic bad decisions, but through small acts of neglect or overconfidence that create vulnerabilities they don't even know exist. The decision to depart despite marginal weather forecasts, the failure to properly test the bilge pump before leaving, the choice to carry minimal fuel reserves because you're confident in your calculations. These hour 0 decisions set the stage for everything that follows. Hour 1 to 3, something goes wrong. A piece of equipment fails, weather deteriorates faster than forecast, you discover you're off course due to current effects you didn't properly account for. At this point, the situation is concerning but not yet critical. You have time to assess the problem, consider options, implement solutions. This is when good decision-making can prevent escalation to true emergency. The sailors who survive are the ones who recognize problems early and respond appropriately, who activate emergency beacons when things start going wrong, rather than waiting until they're certain they need rescue, who make conservative decisions about abandoning compromised plans in favor of seeking safety. The sailors who die are often the ones who minimize problems, who convince themselves they can fix things or ride it out, who delay calling for help because they don't want to admit they need it. Hour 3 to 6. The situation is now clearly an emergency. Your vessel is taking on water or losing critical systems. Weather has made conditions dangerous. You're significantly off course and running low on fuel. You've activated your EPIRB. You're attempting to bail water or make repairs. You're trying to maintain vessel control while also dealing with the immediate crisis. Your body is starting to show the effects of stress and exertion. Elevated heart rate, adrenaline surges, decision-making affected by anxiety. This is when training and muscle memory matter most, when practiced emergency procedures can be executed even under stress because you've rehearsed them. This is also when physical conditioning matters, when your ability to maintain high-intensity work determines whether you can keep your vessel functional long enough for rescue to arrive. Hour 6 to 12, you've been fighting the emergency for hours now. If you haven't already abandoned ship, you're making critical decisions about whether to stay with the vessel or evacuate to a life raft. Your physical reserves are depleting. You might be hypothermic if you've been working in wet conditions, or dehydrated if conditions have been hot. Your judgment is starting to be affected by exhaustion and stress. Rescue hasn't arrived yet, and you're starting to wonder if it's coming at all. This is the period where mental resilience becomes crucial, where maintaining hope and continuing to execute survival tasks rather than surrendering to despair can make the difference between life and death. The sailors who survive this phase are the ones who can maintain function despite exhaustion, who continue bailing or navigating or implementing survival procedures even when it seems hopeless. Hour 12 to 24. If you've abandoned to a life raft, you're now dealing with the full horror of that environment. Seasickness, dehydration beginning, exhaustion from the evacuation and the hours before it, uncertainty about whether rescue is coming. If you're still on your vessel, you've been fighting the emergency for half a day now. and your body and mind are seriously compromised. This is when people start making the mistakes that kill them. Drinking seawater because they're desperately thirsty, giving up on bailing because they're too exhausted to continue, failing to maintain watch for rescue assets because they can't stay focused. Rescue operations are active, but finding you in the ocean is challenging even with your EPIRB coordinates, and weather might be preventing rescue assets from reaching you even if they know exactly where you are. Hour 24 to 48. You're now into your second day of the emergency. If you're in a life raft, dehydration is becoming severe, your cognitive function is noticeably impaired, you're experiencing hallucinations and confusion. If you're still on your vessel, you've probably lost the battle with whatever problem was threatening to sink it, and you're either in a life raft now or you're dead. Rescue teams are still searching, but the probability of successful rescue is dropping with every hour because survivor condition is deteriorating, because weather might force suspension of search operations, because the search area is expanding as you drift with current. This is when luck becomes the dominant factor in survival, when whether rescue finds you depends more on chance than on anything you can control. Hour 48 to 72, you're reaching the limit of human survival without water. If you're in a life raft and haven't been rescued by now, your chances are poor and declining rapidly. Your organs are failing, your brain function is severely impaired, you're drifting in and out of consciousness. Rescue operations might still be active, but search coordinators are making calculations about probability of survival versus resource allocation, and those calculations are not in your favor. Some people survive to this point and get rescued and recover. Many don't. The difference often comes down to factors you couldn't control, whether the search pattern happened to cover your location, whether weather allowed rescue operations to continue, whether you had enough physical reserves to survive long enough. Beyond 72 hours, survival is rare but not impossible. There are documented cases of people surviving a week or more in life rafts, usually through some combination of rainwater collection, exceptional physical condition, mental resilience that sustained them past the point where most people give up, and luck in terms of weather and rescue timing. But statistical reality is that if you're still adrift after 3 days, you're probably going to die, and your death will be recorded as another mysterious disappearance in the Bermuda Triangle, when really it's just the straightforward biology of dehydration and exposure running its course. As we approach the end of this exploration, let's acknowledge something that might seem paradoxical. Despite everything we've discussed about the dangers of the Bermuda Triangle, thousands of people transit this region successfully every single day, and most of them never experience anything remotely resembling the emergencies and disasters we've been describing in such visceral detail. Commercial airlines fly through this airspace carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers annually with safety records that are actually quite impressive. Cruise ships transit these waters with millions of passengers who spend their voyages enjoying buffets and deck chairs rather than fighting for survival. Private vessels make passages through the triangle constantly, with most experiencing nothing more dramatic than some moderate weather or maybe a minor equipment issue that's handled with routine troubleshooting. The Bermuda Triangle is not actually a death trap where survival is unlikely. It's a normal ocean region where survival is likely if you approach it with appropriate preparation and respect. So why have we spent 28 chapters discussing all the ways you could die here? Because understanding worst-case scenarios, really comprehending what can go wrong, and how quickly and how fatally is essential to developing the mindset that keeps you safe. The sailors who survive maritime emergencies are usually the ones who've thought through disaster scenarios, who've imagined themselves in dire situations and considered how they'd respond, who've mentally rehearsed the progression from routine to emergency to survival. This kind of mental preparation isn't morbid or pessimistic, it's practical and potentially life-saving. By walking through all these scenarios, by understanding the mechanisms of how storms kill people and how dehydration progresses and how rescue operations work and how equipment fails, you're building mental models that will serve you if you ever face real emergencies. You'll recognize problems earlier because you understand what they can escalate into. You'll make better decisions because you've already considered the options and their consequences. You'll be less likely to panic because the situation, while serious, matches scenarios you've already imagined and thought through. This is how training works in every high-stakes domain. Pilots spend hours in simulators experiencing emergencies so that if they encounter similar situations in real flight, they're executing practiced responses rather than improvising desperately. Soldiers train for combat scenarios repeatedly so that when bullets start flying, they're following procedures they've internalized. Surgeons practice on cadavers and models before operating on living patients. Maritime safety works the same way. The more you've thought through emergencies, the better equipped you are to handle them if they occur. But there's also a balance to strike here, because excessive focus on danger can lead to paralysis, to never venturing onto the ocean because you're too aware of everything that could go wrong. This is not the lesson we want you to take from this exploration. The ocean is dangerous, yes, but it's also magnificent and worth experiencing, and millions of people engage with it safely every year because they approach it with appropriate preparation and respect. The goal isn't to scare you away from maritime activities. It's to encourage you to engage with them competently, to understand what you're getting into, to respect the environment you're entering, to prepare appropriately for the challenges you might face. The Bermuda Triangle specifically, and the ocean generally, will always carry some level of risk. That risk can be managed through preparation, skill, equipment, and conservative decision-making, but it can never be eliminated entirely. Accepting this reality, being comfortable with operating in an environment where perfect safety is impossible, is part of what it means to be a sailor or pilot or anyone who regularly ventures onto or over the ocean. You acknowledge the risks, you do everything reasonable to mitigate them, and then you accept that some residual risk remains and you proceed anyway because the activity is valuable or necessary or rewarding enough to justify that risk. Different people will have different risk tolerances, different levels of preparation they consider adequate, different thresholds for when conditions are too dangerous to proceed. There's no single right answer to how much risk is acceptable. It's a personal decision that depends on your skills, your equipment, your experience, and your own assessment of risk versus reward. But whatever your risk tolerance, that decision should be informed by accurate understanding of actual dangers rather than by supernatural mythology or by dismissive overconfidence. The Bermuda Triangle isn't mysteriously dangerous, but it is genuinely dangerous in ways that are well understood and that require respect and preparation. Let's also acknowledge the role of luck one more time, because it's important not to fall into the trap of thinking that good preparation guarantees good outcomes. We've discussed how luck factors into survival, how identical preparation can lead to different outcomes based on factors beyond anyone's control. This means you need humility about your own survival if you've transited the Bermuda Triangle successfully. recognizing that your success was due partly to your preparation and partly to fortune. And it means you should have compassion for those who died despite making similar preparations, understanding that they weren't necessarily less competent or less careful, they were just less lucky. This humility and compassion are important because they prevent the kind of survivor bias where successful outcomes are attributed entirely to skill, while unsuccessful outcomes are attributed to incompetence, when reality is that both skill and luck play significant roles in determining who survives and who doesn't. The ocean is ultimately indifferent to human life. It doesn't care about your preparation or your experience or your confidence. It applies physics and biology relentlessly, and whether you survive depends on whether your preparation and skills and luck are sufficient to handle whatever challenges the ocean presents in that particular moment. Sometimes the challenges are minimal and almost anyone would survive. Sometimes the challenges are catastrophic and almost no one would survive. Most of the time, the challenges are somewhere in the middle, and survival depends on that combination of preparation, skill, decision-making, and luck that we've been discussing throughout this exploration. Understanding this reality, really internalizing it rather than just intellectually acknowledging it, changes how you approach maritime activities. You stop assuming that bad outcomes only happen to other people who weren't as prepared or skilled as you are. You stop treating safety equipment as unnecessary weight or bureaucratic requirement. You stop dismissing weather forecasts that suggest delaying departure. You stop pushing your limits because you're confident things will work out. You develop a healthy respect for an environment that has been efficiently killing humans since we first ventured onto water. And that respect translates into behaviors and decisions that significantly improve your survival odds without requiring you to be paralyzed by fear or to avoid the ocean entirely. So here we are at the end of our exploration, 30 chapters deep into understanding why you wouldn't survive a day in the Bermuda Triangle. And the conclusion should be clear. The title is deliberately provocative, because most people actually would survive a day in the Bermuda Triangle if they approached it with appropriate preparation, competence, and respect. The wouldn't survive formulation is really about what happens when you don't have those things. When you venture onto the ocean with overconfidence or inadequate preparation or dismissive attitudes toward the dangers involved. It's about understanding that survival is not guaranteed, that the ocean can kill you through 1,000 different mechanisms, ranging from violent and sudden to slow and agonizing, and that respecting those dangers is the foundation of maritime safety. The Bermuda Triangle serves as a perfect case study for these principles because it's famous enough that everyone knows the name. It's been surrounded by enough mythology that examining the reality versus the legend is instructive. And it's genuinely challenging enough as a maritime environment that discussing its dangers isn't fear-mongering, but rather honest education about what ocean travel entails. Everything we've discussed about the Bermuda Triangle applies to ocean navigation generally. The importance of weather awareness, the challenges of navigation in areas with strong currents, the need for proper equipment and the skill to use it, the psychological demands of handling emergencies, the physical toll of extended survival situations, the role of luck in determining outcomes. The triangle isn't unique in these respects, it's representative. So the real lesson of this exploration isn't avoid the Bermuda Triangle because it's mysteriously dangerous. It's understand that ocean environments are challenging and demand respect, preparation, and competence. And if you provide those things, you can engage with them safely. And if you don't provide those things, you're accepting risks that could result in your death. This applies to the Bermuda Triangle, the North Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, anywhere that humans venture onto water in vessels that are fundamentally fragile compared to the forces that oceans can generate. Let's return one final time to you, the hypothetical sailor we've been following throughout this exploration. You started floating on that yacht in beautiful Caribbean waters, confident and unprepared, about to discover how quickly things can go wrong when the ocean decides to test you. We've walked you through multiple scenarios: successful rescue after a harrowing ordeal, death from dehydration in a life raft, violent endings from collisions or fires or waterspouts, slow deterioration from equipment failures and navigational errors. These weren't meant to be comprehensive. They were meant to be representative of the range of ways that maritime emergencies develop and resolve. The real you, if you ever venture into the Bermuda Triangle or any other ocean environment, will face your own unique combination of challenges based on your specific preparation, skills, equipment, decisions, and luck. But the principles we've discussed will apply. Your survival will depend on how well you've prepared, how appropriately you respond to developing problems, how your body and mind hold up under stress, and whether fortune puts you in situations your capabilities can handle or situations that overwhelm even optimal responses. What you should take away from this exploration is not fear of the ocean or belief that maritime activities are impossibly dangerous or conviction that the Bermuda Triangle is cursed or mysterious. What you should take away is respect for environments that are fundamentally hostile to human survival. Understanding that engaging with such environments requires serious preparation and appropriate humility, appreciation for the complexity of maritime safety and the multiple factors that determine survival outcomes, and perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that the ocean doesn't care about your confidence or your technology or your intentions. It just applies physics and biology relentlessly. And your survival depends on whether you've adequately prepared for that reality. The Bermuda Triangle will continue to exist as both a geographic reality and a cultural myth. Ships and planes will continue transiting it, mostly successfully, occasionally tragically. The legend will persist because humans are drawn to mystery and prefer exciting supernatural explanations over mundane technical ones. People will continue to write books and make documentaries suggesting that something mysterious and inexplicable happens in this region, despite the overwhelming evidence that accidents there are explainable by normal maritime causes and occur at rates consistent with the traffic volume and environmental conditions. But you, having worked through this exploration, now understand the reality behind the legend. You understand that the Bermuda Triangle isn't mysterious, it's just ocean, and ocean is dangerous in ways that are well understood and that require respect and preparation. You understand that people die there not because of supernatural forces, but because of weather, equipment failure, human error, and bad luck, the same things that kill people in every other part of the world's oceans. You understand that survival requires more than just good equipment or modern technology. It requires knowledge, skill, proper decision-making, physical and mental resilience, and an acknowledgement that some risks remain regardless of how well you prepare. You understand that the boring competence of checking weather forecasts and maintaining equipment and filing float plans and making conservative decisions is what actually keeps people alive, not special knowledge about mysterious forces or exotic countermeasures against supernatural dangers. And perhaps most importantly, you understand that the ocean demands and deserves your respect, not because it's malevolent or mysterious, but because it's powerful and indifferent and has been efficiently killing humans since our species first ventured onto water. That respect, translated into appropriate preparation and conservative decision-making and operation within your capabilities, is what determines whether you survive your day in the Bermuda Triangle or become another data point in the legend, another mysterious disappearance that future generations will speculate about while missing the simple, explicable, tragic reality of what actually happened